There is a monster sleeping under a mountain, a being of fire and shadow, an ancient spirit of unimaginable power, lurking in the darkness beneath the misty mountains, while the greatest war in the history of the Third Age rages above it. The Balrog of Moria. Durin's Bane. A creature that can go toe-to-toe with a wizard and win. A creature that killed Gandalf the Grey. That forced one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth to sacrifice his life just to stop it. This creature is sleeping under a mountain, less than 300 miles from the battlefields where Sauron's armies are fighting to conquer the world. And Sauron does not use it. The Dark Lord of Mordor, the master strategist, the being who has spent 3,000 years building toward the moment of his final victory. This being has access to one of the most devastating weapons left over from the wars of the Elder Days, and he leaves it sitting in a hole in the ground. Sauron sends 10,000 Uruk-hai to Helm's Deep. He sends hundreds of thousands of orcs and trolls and Easterlings to the Pelennor fields. He sends the Nazgul, all 9 of them, to scour the countryside for the ring. But the Balrog? The ancient fire spirit that could have burned through the walls of Minas Tirith like a torch through paper? Sauron leaves it alone. Why? Tonight I want to answer that question, fully, deeply, in a way that I think most fans have never considered. Because the answer is not simple. The answer is not Sauron forgot about the Balrog or Tolkien made a plot hole. The answer reaches into the deepest foundations of Tolkien's world, into the nature of evil, the hierarchy of dark powers, the theology of fallen spirits, and the fundamental difference between Morgoth's dominion and Sauron's dominion. The answer changes how you understand Sauron. It changes how you understand the Balrog. And it changes how you understand the entire power structure of evil in Middle-earth, because the reason Sauron did not use the Balrog is the same reason that Sauron's power, for all its terrifying scope, was fundamentally different from the power of his old master. And the difference is the key to everything. Stay with me. This goes deeper than you think. Part 1. The question that haunts the war. Let me start by framing the question properly, because the question itself reveals something important about the way we think about Sauron, and about the assumptions we bring to the story that Tolkien would not have shared. When most people ask why didn't Sauron use the Balrog, they are assuming something. They are assuming that the Balrog was Sauron's to use. They are assuming that the relationship between Sauron and the Balrog was like the relationship between a general and a weapon. That the Balrog was an asset in Sauron's arsenal, a resource to be deployed, a piece on the chessboard that Sauron could move wherever he wanted. This assumption is wrong, and the wrongness of the assumption is the beginning of the answer. The Balrog was not Sauron's. The Balrog did not serve Sauron. The Balrog did not answer to Sauron. The Balrog did not take orders from Sauron or report to Sauron or recognize Sauron's authority in any meaningful way. The Balrog was its own creature, a remnant of a different age, a survivor of a different war, a servant of a different master who had been overthrown thousands of years before Sauron began his campaign for the ring. The Balrog served Morgoth, and Morgoth was gone. This is the foundation. Everything else follows from this. The Balrog was not a piece in Sauron's game, because the Balrog was never part of Sauron's game. The Balrog was part of Morgoth's game, a game that ended at the conclusion of the First Age, when the Valar broke down the doors of Angband and cast Morgoth into the void and scattered his servants across the wreckage of a continent. The Balrog that hid under the misty mountains was a fugitive, a survivor, a creature that had escaped the destruction of its master's fortress and had burrowed into the earth and had been hiding there for nearly 6,000 years, not waiting for orders, not serving a purpose, not carrying out a mission. Hiding, sleeping, existing in the darkness without direction, without loyalty, without the commanding will that had once given its existence shape and meaning. Sauron could no more command this creature than you could command a sleeping tiger by walking into its cave and announcing that you were in charge. Part 2. The nature of Balrogs. To understand why Sauron could not use the Balrog, we need to understand what Balrogs actually are, because the answer to the question is embedded in the answer to a deeper question. What kind of creature is a Balrog? Balrogs are Maya. This is the single most important fact about Balrogs, and it is the fact that most fans either overlook or do not fully appreciate. Balrogs are not monsters in the conventional sense. They are not beasts. They are not animals. They are not creatures that were bred or built or manufactured by some dark power. Balrogs are Maya, the same order of spiritual beings as Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and Sauron himself. The Maya are the lesser Ainu, the divine spirits who participated in the creation of the world, who sang in the great music before the world existed, who shaped the land and the sea and the sky in the early days of Arda's existence. The Maya are, in Tolkien's cosmology, something like angels, beings of immense power and ancient origin, created by Ilúvatar before the beginning of time, endowed with individual wills and individual natures, and the capacity to choose their own paths. Gandalf is a Maya. Saruman is a Maya. Sauron is a Maya. And the Balrogs, the Valorokar, the demons of power, are Maya too. This means that the Balrog under the Misty Mountains is not a weapon. It is not an animal. It is not a tool. It is a person, a fallen, corrupted, fire-wreathed person, yes, but a person nonetheless. A being with its own will, its own nature, its own history, its own relationship to the powers that shaped the world. The Balrog is a spiritual being of the same fundamental order as Sauron, not a subordinate, not a servant, not a resource to be deployed, but a peer. A fellow Maya. A creature of comparable origin and comparable dignity, however deeply that dignity has been corrupted. And this is the first reason that Sauron could not simply use the Balrog. You do not use a being of equal standing. You do not deploy a creature that is, in the cosmic hierarchy, your peer. You might persuade it. You might bargain with it. You might try to dominate it. But you do not pick it up and move it like a chess piece, because it is not a chess piece. It is a player. Part 3. The hierarchy under Morgoth. To understand the relationship between Sauron and the Balrogs, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the First Age, back to the wars against Morgoth. Back to the dark fortress of Angband where the first Dark Lord held court over his servants. Morgoth Melkor, the mightiest of the Valar, the first being to introduce discord into the great music, was the supreme power of evil in the Elder Days. Morgoth was not a Maya. He was a Valar, a being of a fundamentally higher order, more powerful than any of the spirits who served him, more powerful than Sauron, more powerful than the Balrogs, more powerful than any single creature in Middle-earth except the other Valar. Under Morgoth, the hierarchy was clear. Sauron was the chief lieutenant, the most trusted, the most capable, the most strategically valuable of Morgoth's servants. Sauron ran operations. Sauron coordinated armies. Sauron managed intelligence. Sauron was, in modern terms, the chief of staff, the being who turned Morgoth's will into action. The Balrogs were something different. The Balrogs were Morgoth's shock troops, his elite warriors, his most terrifying instruments of destruction. The beings who led the charges and broke the formations and killed the elven lords who stood against the darkness. The Balrogs were not administrators. They were not strategists. They were weapons of war, not in the sense of mindless tools, but in the sense of beings whose nature was oriented toward destruction rather than organization. The relationship between Sauron and the Balrogs under Morgoth was not a command relationship. Sauron did not give orders to the Balrogs. The Balrogs did not report to Sauron. Both Sauron and the Balrogs reported to Morgoth. Both served the same master. Both received their instructions from the same source. Both operated within the same hierarchy. But the hierarchy was flat beneath Morgoth's authority. Sauron and the Balrogs were parallel assets, different tools for different purposes, serving the same master but not serving each other. This is a crucial distinction. In Morgoth's court, Sauron was the administrator and the Balrogs were the warriors. The administrator did not command the warriors. The warriors did not obey the administrator. Both obeyed Morgoth, and only Morgoth. When Morgoth fell, the hierarchy collapsed. The master was gone. The organizing will was removed. And the servants, Sauron, the Balrogs, the lesser creatures of Morgoth's dominion, were left without the authority that had held them together. Each went their own way. Each pursued their own survival. And the structure that had made them a coordinated force, the structure that had made them an army rather than a collection of independent predators, dissolved. The dissolution is important because it was total. There was no succession plan. There was no designated heir. Morgoth did not appoint Sauron as his successor. Sauron assumed the mantle, seized it really, through ambition and capability and the sheer force of his personality. But the assumption was not recognized by the other surviving servants of Morgoth. The Balrogs did not kneel before Sauron. The dragons did not swear allegiance. The surviving creatures of the dark did not hold a council and elect Sauron as their new leader. Sauron became the Dark Lord of the Second and Third Ages through his own efforts, through the forging of the ring, through the building of Mordor, through the patient, centuries-long accumulation of power and influence that made him the dominant dark force in Middle-earth. But dominant is not supreme. Sauron's dominance is earned, not inherited. Sauron's authority extends over the creatures he has personally enslaved or recruited, not over the creatures that Morgoth enslaved and that Morgoth's fall left masterless. The Balrog is one of these masterless creatures, and the Balrog's masterlessness is the key to the entire question. Part 4. The Fall of Morgoth. The War of Wrath. The final battle of the First Age. The Valar themselves marched against Morgoth, sending the host of Valinor to Middle-earth, breaking down the gates of Angband, casting Morgoth into the void beyond the walls of night. The destruction was catastrophic. Beleriand, the entire western continent where the wars of the First Age had been fought, sank beneath the sea. The land was destroyed. The fortresses were broken. The armies were scattered. And the servants of Morgoth, the orcs, the trolls, the dragons, and the Balrogs, were either killed or driven into hiding. Most of the Balrogs died. The great Balrog lords, the captains of Morgoth's fire host, the beings who had led the assault on Gondolin, who had slain Fëanor, who had duelled elf lords and broken elven armies, were destroyed in the War of Wrath. The host of Valinor was overwhelming. The power of the Valar, brought to bear in full force for the first time since the world was made, was irresistible. The Balrogs, for all their terrible power, were not powerful enough to withstand the fury of the divine assault. The deaths of the other Balrogs are worth remembering, because they establish the mortality of the species. The fact that Balrogs can be killed, that their power, however great, has limits, that the fire and the shadow are not eternal. Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, the greatest of Morgoth's fire captains, was killed at the fall of Gondolin by Ecthelion of the Fountain. Killed by an elf, killed by a mortal-bodied being who drove a spike through the Balrog's chest and dragged the creature into a fountain where both of them drowned. Another Balrog was killed at Gondolin by Glorfindel, the golden-haired elf lord who fell from a precipice while wrestling the creature, who died killing the thing that threatened his people's escape. These deaths tell us that Balrogs are formidable but not invincible. They can be fought, they can be beaten, they can be destroyed by beings of sufficient courage and sufficient power. The Balrog is terrifying. The Balrog is devastating. But the Balrog is not unbeatable, and a strategist as careful as Sauron would know this. A strategist as careful as Sauron would know that deploying a Balrog risks the Balrog's death, and the death of a Balrog in full view of the enemy is the kind of moral event that can turn a battle in the wrong direction. But one survived. At least one Balrog escaped the destruction of Angband and the sinking of Beleriand. This Balrog, the creature that would eventually be known as Durin's Bane, fled eastward. It crossed the ruins of the drowning continent. It found the misty mountains. And it burrowed into the deep places of the earth, beneath the roots of the mountains, into the darkness where the light of the Valar could not reach, and the justice of the host of Valinor could not follow. And there it stayed, for nearly 6,000 years, from the end of the First Age through the entirety of the Second Age and into the latter portion of the Third Age. The Balrog slept under the misty mountains, hidden, dormant, forgotten by the world above. 6,000 years. Think about that. 6,000 years of hiding in the dark. 6,000 years of existing without purpose, without direction, without the commanding will that had once given the Balrog's existence its shape. The creature that had been one of Morgoth's elite warriors, a captain of the fire host, a being whose nature was oriented toward battle and destruction, was lying in the earth like a buried coal, still hot, still dangerous, but serving nothing and no one. The Balrog was not waiting for Sauron. The Balrog was not waiting for anyone. The Balrog was hiding, the way a wounded animal hides, the way a fugitive hides, the way a creature that has lost everything hides in the darkness and does not move and does not speak and does not act, because acting would mean being found, and being found would mean being destroyed. Part 5. The Waking. The Balrog slept until the dwarves woke it. In the year 1980 of the Third Age, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, the great dwarven kingdom under the misty mountains, the most prosperous and the most ambitious of the dwarven realms, dug too deep. The dwarves were mining mithril, the precious silver metal that was found only in Khazad-dûm, the most valuable substance in Middle-earth, the metal from which Bilbo's famous coat of mail was made. The mithril veins ran deep, deeper than the dwarves had ever gone before, deeper than any mining operation in the history of the world. And the dwarves followed the veins downward, driven by the desire for wealth, driven by the craftsman's hunger for the finest raw materials, driven by the ambition that defines the dwarven character. And they found the Balrog. The dwarves dug into the chamber where the creature had been sleeping for nearly 5,000 years. They broke through the rock. They opened the space. And the Balrog, disturbed, awakened, roused from the long dormancy that had kept it hidden from the world, woke up. And it was angry. The waking of the Balrog is one of the great catastrophes of the Third Age. Durin VI, the king of Khazad-dûm, was killed. His son Nin I was killed the following year. The dwarves were driven from their kingdom, expelled from the greatest and the most ancient of their halls by a single creature that was more powerful than their entire civilization combined. The expulsion is worth dwelling on, because it tells us something crucial about the scale of the Balrog's power. Khazad-dûm was the mightiest dwarven realm in the history of Middle-earth. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm had been mining, building, and fortifying their kingdom for thousands of years. They had armies. They had weapons. They had the accumulated military technology of the most industrious and the most skilled craftsmen in the world. And they could not fight one creature. The Balrog drove them out, not through an army, not through a siege, not through the kind of strategic campaign that might be resisted or countered. Through the simple, overwhelming, irresistible force of a single Maya in full fury. This is the power that Sauron would theoretically want to deploy. And this is the power that makes the deployment impossible. Because a creature capable of single-handedly destroying the greatest dwarven kingdom in history is not a creature that can be pointed at a target and trusted to stay on task. A creature of this magnitude is not a weapon. It is a catastrophe, a force of nature that goes where it goes and destroys what it encounters, without regard for the strategic objectives of the being who unleashed it. The dwarves called the creature Durin's Bane. The name is significant. It defines the Balrog in relation to the dwarves, in relation to the damage it caused, in relation to the kingdom it destroyed. The dwarves did not call it Morgoth's servant, or the fallen Maya, or the refugee from Angband. They called it Durin's Bane, the destroyer of Durin, the killer of their king, the creature that took their home. The naming tells us how the world sees the Balrog at this point in history. The Balrog is not a servant of any dark power. The Balrog is a force of nature, a disaster, a catastrophe, a thing that happens to you rather than a thing that serves someone's purpose. The Balrog is defined by what it destroys, not by whom it serves. And this is the state of the Balrog when Sauron begins his campaign for the ring. The Balrog is in Moria. The Balrog is alone. The Balrog is not serving anyone. The Balrog is a solitary, masterless, purposeless creature of immense power, sitting in the ruins of a dwarven kingdom, surrounded by the orcs and goblins that have infested the abandoned halls, existing without direction and without allegiance. Part 6. What Sauron knew. Did Sauron know about the Balrog? The answer is almost certainly yes, at least in broad terms. Sauron knew that something powerful dwelt in Moria. He knew that the dwarves had been driven from Khazad-dûm by a creature of fire and shadow. He knew, from his intelligence network, that the ancient kingdom was now a place of darkness and danger. Sauron also had orcs in Moria. This is important. The orc presence in Moria was not independent of Sauron's operations. The goblins and the orcs that infested the abandoned halls of Khazad-dûm were, in many cases, connected to Sauron's broader network, receiving instructions, sharing intelligence, coordinating with other orc populations throughout the mountains and the east. Sauron's reach extended to Moria. His influence touched the creatures that lived there. But there is a significant difference between having orcs in Moria and commanding the Balrog of Moria. The orcs obeyed Sauron because orcs were bred to obey. The orcs were creatures of Morgoth's making, beings whose nature had been twisted by the original Dark Lord's corrupting influence, who were programmed at the deepest level of their being to submit to the will of a dominant dark power. Sauron inherited the orcs from Morgoth. Sauron could command the orcs because the orcs were designed to be commanded. The Balrog was not designed to be commanded. The Balrog was designed to destroy, to lead charges, to break formations, to burn and to kill. The Balrog was not an orc. It was not a creature that had been bred for obedience. It was a Maya, a being of independent will, of autonomous judgment, of personal agency. The Balrog chose to serve Morgoth. The Balrog was not compelled. And this is the critical difference. The orcs in Moria obeyed Sauron because they had no choice. The Balrog in Moria did not obey Sauron because it did have a choice, and the Balrog's choice for 6,000 years had been to hide, to sleep, to exist in the darkness without serving anyone or anything. The Balrog had chosen isolation, chosen it with the autonomous will of a fallen Maya, chosen it deliberately and consistently for millennia. Sauron knew the Balrog was there, but knowing and commanding are not the same thing. This distinction is the one that most discussions of the Balrog question fail to make. Fans assume that awareness equals authority, that because Sauron knew about the Balrog, Sauron could control the Balrog. The assumption confuses intelligence with power. Sauron's intelligence apparatus was formidable. His spies were everywhere. His informants reached into the courts of kings and the councils of the wise. Sauron knew a great deal about the world and the forces operating within it. But knowledge is not the same as control. Knowing where a creature is does not give you the ability to command it. Knowing what a creature can do does not give you the right to direct its actions. A useful comparison: Sauron also knew about Gandalf. Sauron knew where Gandalf was. Sauron knew what Gandalf was capable of. Sauron had extensive intelligence about Gandalf's movements, Gandalf's alliances, Gandalf's strategic objectives. But Sauron could not command Gandalf. Sauron could not direct Gandalf. Sauron's knowledge of Gandalf did not translate into authority over Gandalf, because Gandalf, like the Balrog, was a Maya, a being of independent will, a creature that could not be controlled by knowledge alone. The same principle applies to the Balrog. Sauron knew. Sauron could not command. Part 7. The problem of authority. Here is the core of the problem. Sauron had no authority over the Balrog. Authority, in Tolkien's world, is not simply a matter of power. It is a matter of legitimacy, of rightful claim, of recognized dominion, of the acknowledged relationship between a ruler and a ruled. Morgoth had authority over the Balrogs because the Balrogs had chosen to follow him, had chosen, in the great music before the world was made, to align themselves with Morgoth's discord, to serve his purposes, to place their wills beneath his. Sauron never had this relationship with the Balrogs. Sauron was their colleague, not their commander. Sauron served the same master, fought in the same wars, pursued the same goals. But the Balrogs did not serve Sauron. They served Morgoth. And when Morgoth fell, the Balrogs' service ended, not transferred, not redirected, not bequeathed to the next Dark Lord in line. Ended. The loyalty that the Balrogs gave to Morgoth was personal. It was not institutional. It did not pass to Morgoth's successor the way a crown passes to the next king. Sauron understood this. Sauron was, if nothing else, a sophisticated political thinker, a being who understood power structures, who understood the dynamics of loyalty and command, who understood, with the precision of a master manipulator, the difference between what he could control and what he could not. Sauron could control the Nazgul, because the Nazgul were bound to the rings, and the rings were bound to the One Ring, and the One Ring was Sauron's. The chain of domination was clear. The mechanism of control was precise. Sauron owned the Nazgul in the most literal sense, owned their will, their autonomy, their very capacity for independent thought. Sauron could control the orcs, because the orcs were bred for obedience. The orcs had no real autonomy. They followed the strongest dark will in their vicinity, and Sauron's will, projected from Barad-dûrtr through the apparatus of the Ring and the Palantir and the Nazgul, was the strongest dark will in Middle-earth. Sauron could control Saruman, indirectly, through the Palantir, by manipulating the wizard's pride and feeding his delusions. The control was not complete, but it was effective enough to turn the head of the Istari Order into a useful tool. But the Balrog? The Balrog was not bound by a ring. The Balrog was not bred for obedience. The Balrog was not susceptible to the kind of psychological manipulation that worked on Saruman. The Balrog was a Maya, a being of the same order as Sauron, with a will as strong as Sauron's will, with a nature as autonomous as Sauron's nature, with a history of serving a master who was greater than Sauron had ever been. You cannot command your peer. You cannot order a creature that is, in the deepest sense, your equal. You can persuade, you can bargain, you can threaten, but you cannot command, and the difference is enormous. Command is reliable. Command is instant. Command produces obedience without negotiation. Persuasion, bargaining, and threatening are uncertain. They take time. They produce compliance rather than obedience, and compliance can be withdrawn. Part 8. The question of the ring. But wait, what about the One Ring? Doesn't the One Ring give Sauron the power to dominate other wills? Couldn't Sauron have used the ring to impose his will on the Balrog? The answer is complicated, and the complication reveals something essential about the nature of the ring and the limits of its power. The One Ring was designed to dominate the bearers of the other rings of power. It was forged to control the 3, the 7, and the 9, to bring the elves, the dwarves, and the men who wore those rings under Sauron's authority. The ring's power of domination was specific. It was targeted. It was designed for a particular purpose, the subjugation of the ring bearers, and, through them, the subjugation of the peoples they led. The ring could also dominate lesser wills, the wills of orcs, of trolls, of the lesser creatures of Middle-earth, whose autonomous resistance was too weak to withstand the ring's influence. But the ring's power of domination weakened as the will it was trying to dominate grew stronger. The ring could easily dominate an orc. It could struggle to dominate a man. It would face fierce resistance from an elf lord like Galadriel or Elrond, perhaps overcoming them eventually, but only through a long and uncertain contest. And a Maia like Gandalf would present an even more formidable barrier. The Balrog is a Maia. The Balrog's will is a Maia's will, powerful, ancient, rooted in the deepest foundations of creation. The ring's power of domination, formidable as it is, was not designed to operate against a will of this magnitude. The ring was made to capture men and dwarves and elves. It was not made to capture Maia. Could Sauron, wearing the ring at its full power, have attempted to dominate the Balrog? Perhaps, but the attempt would have been uncertain at best and catastrophic at worst. The Balrog's will, hardened by thousands of years of solitary existence, shaped by the same dark fires that shaped Sauron's own nature, would have resisted. And the resistance of a Maia is not the passive, crumbling resistance of a mortal. The resistance of a Maia is active, dynamic, powered by the same spiritual energy that powers the resistance of the mountains to the wind. And there is another consideration. Sauron did not have the ring. Not during the War of the Ring, not during the period when the question of using the Balrog was relevant. The ring was on Frodo's finger, then in Gollum's hand, then in the fire. Sauron was operating without his greatest instrument of domination, and without the ring, his ability to impose his will on a fellow Maia was even more limited. Part 9. Peers, not subordinates. The relationship between Sauron and the Balrog becomes clearer when we understand the concept of spiritual parity, the idea that beings of the same order have a natural resistance to each other's domination. In Tolkien's theology, the universe is organized in a hierarchy. Ilúvatar is at the top. Beneath Ilúvatar are the Valar, the great powers, the shaping forces of the world. Beneath the Valar are the Maiar, the lesser spirits, the servants and assistants of the Valar. Beneath the Maiar are the children of Ilúvatar, elves and men, the beings for whom the world was made. Domination flows downward in this hierarchy. A Vala can dominate a Maia. A Maia can dominate an elf or a man. but a Maya cannot easily dominate another Maya. Because the two beings occupy the same level of the hierarchy, because their spiritual powers are of the same order and the same magnitude, because neither possesses the inherent advantage that comes from occupying a higher rung on the cosmic ladder. This is why Morgoth could command the Balrogs and Sauron cannot. Morgoth was a Valar, the Balrogs were Maya. The hierarchy gave Morgoth the spiritual authority to command beings of a lower order. Sauron is a Maya. The Balrogs are Maya. The hierarchy gives Sauron no such advantage. Sauron and the Balrogs are peers, different in their specific powers and their specific histories, but equal in their fundamental nature and their fundamental standing in the cosmic order. The parity extends to their relationship with the dark. Both Sauron and the Balrogs fell to darkness through Morgoth's influence. Both were corrupted in the same era, by the same power, through the same process. Both carry the same mark, the mark of Morgoth's discord, the imprint of the original Dark Lord's corrupting will. They are brothers in darkness, fellow servants of a fallen master, companions in corruption. But brothers are not subordinates. Companions are not servants. And the dark fellowship that connects Sauron to the Balrog does not give either of them the right to command the other. In fact, the shared corruption may actually make the relationship harder, not easier. Two beings who were corrupted by the same master carry the same pride, the same Morgoth-implanted arrogance, the same dark certainty that they are right and the world is wrong. The same refusal to submit to any authority less than the one that originally bent their will. The Balrog and Sauron share the same spiritual disease, and one symptom of the disease is the inability to recognize anyone else's authority. Morgoth broke them both. But Morgoth's breaking did not make them obedient to each other. It made them obedient to Morgoth, and to Morgoth alone. The parallel is illuminating when you consider the other Maiar who fell. Saruman, a Maiar who was corrupted not by Morgoth but by his own pride and by Sauron's manipulation, also refused to serve Sauron. Saruman set up his own operation. Saruman pursued his own ring. Saruman declared himself Saruman of many colours, a title that deliberately distinguished him from Gandalf the Grey and Saruman the White and Sauron the Dark, a title that announced his independence from every other power in Middle-earth. Even Saruman, who was weaker than Sauron and who knew it, could not bring himself to serve. The Maya nature resists domination by another Maya. The spiritual parity creates a barrier that ambition and manipulation and even the ring itself cannot easily breach. Part 10. What Morgoth had that Sauron didn't. The difference between Morgoth's power and Sauron's power is the key to understanding why the Balrog remained unused during the War of the Ring. And the difference is not what most people think. Most people assume that the difference is quantity, that Morgoth was simply stronger than Sauron, that Morgoth had more power, more force, more raw capability. This is true, as far as it goes. Morgoth was a Valar, the mightiest of the Valar before his fall, and his native power dwarfed anything that a Maya like Sauron could muster. But the more important difference is quality. The kind of power that Morgoth wielded was fundamentally different from the kind of power that Sauron wielded. And the difference in kind is what explains the Balrog. Morgoth's power was what Tolkien called dissemination. The pouring of his own essence into the world, the infusion of his will into the fabric of reality itself. Morgoth did not merely command from a throne. He spread himself, his corruption, his influence, his spiritual substance, into the physical world, into the matter of ardor, into the very stuff of creation. Morgoth's power became part of the world. It saturated the earth and the air and the water. It touched everything. This dissemination gave Morgoth a kind of authority that was not merely political or military. It was ontological. Morgoth's corruption was woven into the fabric of reality, and the creatures who were born in or shaped by that corrupted reality, the orcs, the trolls, the dragons, the Balrogs, were connected to Morgoth at a level deeper than loyalty. They were connected to him at the level of being. Morgoth's power was in them. They were made of his influence, shaped by his will, animated by the dark energy that he had poured into the world. Tolkien called this Morgoth's Ring, a term he used in his later writings to describe the way Morgoth had poured his essence into the physical substance of Middle-earth, the way the entire world had become, in a sense, Morgoth's Ring. Just as Sauron placed his power into the One Ring, Morgoth placed his power into the world itself. The difference in scale is staggering. Sauron made a ring. Morgoth made the world into his ring. Sauron's instrument of domination is a piece of gold. Morgoth's instrument of domination is the earth beneath your feet. This is why the Balrogs served Morgoth with an obedience that was absolute and unquestioning. The Balrogs did not serve Morgoth because they had been persuaded or bribed or threatened. They served him because they had been made or remade or reshaped by his influence. The Balrogs' loyalty to Morgoth was not a choice in the ordinary sense. It was a condition, a state of being, a spiritual fact, as fundamental as the fire that wreathed their bodies and the shadow that cloaked their forms. Sauron's power was different. Sauron's power was concentrated, not disseminated. Where Morgoth spread himself thin, pouring his essence into the world until he was diminished by the giving, Sauron concentrated his power into a single object, the One Ring. Sauron's approach was the opposite of Morgoth's. Sauron did not infuse the world with his will. He forged an instrument that could impose his will on the world from a single point. The ring was a lever, not a flood. It was a tool of domination, not a medium of corruption. This approach gave Sauron control over the ring-bearers. It gave him influence over the orcs and the lesser creatures. It gave him the ability to project his will across vast distances, to see through the Palantry, to command the Nazgul with precision and immediacy. But it did not give him the deep ontological authority that Morgoth possessed, the authority that came from being woven into the fabric of the world, from being part of the substance of creation, from having infused your essence into the very being of the creatures you commanded. Sauron's power reached the Balrog's cave, but it could not reach the Balrog's soul. Part 11. The Balrog's nature after Morgoth. When Morgoth fell, something happened to the Balrog, something that is not described in the texts, but that can be inferred from the creature's behavior over the following millennia. The Balrog lost its purpose. Consider what the Balrog was before the fall of Morgoth. It was a captain of the Dark Host. It was a leader of armies, a breaker of fortresses, a slayer of elven lords. It had a role, it had a mission, it had a place in a hierarchy and a function within a system. The Balrog's existence was defined by its service, by the master it served, the wars it fought, the destruction it wreaked in Morgoth's name. And then the master was gone. The wars were over. The fortresses were broken. The armies were scattered. And the Balrog, the being whose entire existence had been oriented toward destruction in the service of Morgoth, had nothing left to serve. The loss of purpose is, I think, one of the most psychologically devastating experiences that a sentient being can undergo. And the Balrog's response to the loss was total withdrawal. The creature did not seek a new master. It did not attempt to rebuild Morgoth's empire. It did not try to coordinate with the other surviving servants of the Dark Lord. It fled. It hid. It burrowed into the earth, and it stayed there, for 6,000 years, doing nothing, serving no one, existing in a state of purposeless dormancy that was less like sleep and more like catatonia. The dormancy tells us something crucial about the Balrog's nature. The Balrog was not a self-directed being. It was not a creature of ambition, of strategy, of independent initiative. The Balrog was a creature of service, a being whose nature was oriented toward following rather than leading, toward executing rather than planning, toward destroying on command rather than destroying on its own initiative. This is the fundamental difference between the Balrog and Sauron. Sauron, after Morgoth's fall, did not hide. Sauron did not withdraw. Sauron did not burrow into the earth and lie dormant for millennia. Sauron rebuilt. Sauron planned. Sauron adapted. Sauron reinvented himself, moving from Morgoth's lieutenant to independent operator, from servant to master, from the chief of staff of a fallen empire to the architect of a new one. Sauron was a builder. The Balrog was a weapon. When the builder lost his master, he built a new kingdom. When the weapon lost its wielder, it lay dormant, inert, unused, waiting for a hand that would never come. Part 12. The solitude of darkness. 6,000 years alone in the dark. I want to dwell on this for a moment, because the duration of the Balrog's isolation is staggering, and the implications of that isolation for the creature's psychological state are important for understanding why it could not simply be recalled to service. 6,000 years. The Balrog has been alone under the mountains for longer than the entirety of recorded human history, for longer than the span between the fall of Morgoth and the forging of the One Ring, for longer than the span between the forging of the ring and the War of the Ring. The Balrog's period of isolation is longer than all the other events of Tolkien's history combined. During that time, the Balrog has had no contact with the outside world. No visitors. No messages. No emissaries from Sauron or from any other power. The Balrog has existed in total sensory and social isolation, alone in the dark, without stimulus, without interaction, without the presence of other minds or other wills. What does this do to a being? What does 6,000 years of solitary darkness do to a Maya? A creature of fire and power, a being whose nature is oriented toward action and destruction, a spirit that was made to burn? I think it drives the creature inward. The Balrog, deprived of external stimuli, deprived of purpose, deprived of the commanding will that once gave its existence direction, the Balrog turns inward. It becomes self-referential. It burns with its own fire, feeds on its own darkness, sustains itself on the remnants of the corruption that Morgoth implanted in it millennia ago. The Balrog becomes a closed system, a creature that exists in relation to nothing but itself, that has no connections to the outside world, that has become so deeply embedded in its own isolation that the isolation has become its identity. A creature in this state is not easily recruited. A creature in this state does not respond to external authority, because the creature no longer recognizes external authority. The Balrog has spent 6,000 years as a universe of one. It has spent 6 millennia answering to no one, serving no one, acknowledging no one. The habit of obedience, the psychological infrastructure that once allowed the Balrog to serve Morgoth, has atrophied. The muscles of submission have withered. The capacity for service has been consumed by the long, slow, corroding solitude of the dark. Sauron could have sent a messenger to the Balrog. The messenger could have entered Moria, descended to the deep places, found the creature in its chamber. But what would the messenger have said? The Dark Lord requests your service, and the Balrog, if it bothered to respond at all, might have said, "What Dark Lord?" "I served one Dark Lord. He is gone. I serve no other. Part 13. The nature of Sauron's power. Sauron's power is the power of domination. This is the defining characteristic of everything Sauron does, every scheme, every strategy, every instrument he creates. Sauron dominates. Sauron controls. Sauron imposes his will on other wills and bends them to his purpose. The rings of power are instruments of domination. The Nazgul are products of domination. The army of Mordor is built on domination. Sauron's entire empire, from the top of Barad-dûr to the lowest orc in the furthest outpost, is a structure of domination, held together by the imposition of Sauron's will on the wills of his subjects. But domination has limits. Domination works on the weak. It works on the corruptible. It works on beings whose wills can be broken, bent, or bought. Domination does not work, or works poorly, on beings whose wills are strong, whose natures are autonomous, whose spiritual foundations are deep enough to resist the pressure of an external will. This is why Gandalf refuses to touch the ring. Gandalf knows that the ring's power of domination would work on him, not immediately, not completely, but eventually and irreversibly. Gandalf's will is strong, but the ring is persistent. And the contest between a strong will and a persistent instrument of domination always ends the same way, with the will's surrender. This is also why Galadriel refuses the ring. Galadriel, who is one of the most powerful elves in Middle-earth, knows that the ring would eventually overcome her. The temptation scene in Lothlorien, the famous instead of a dark lord, you would have a queen moment, is Galadriel acknowledging the ring's power over even the strongest mortal will. But the Balrog is not Gandalf. The Balrog is not Galadriel. The Balrog is not a being that can be tempted, because the Balrog has nothing to desire. The ring works by amplifying existing desires, by taking what you want and promising to give it to you, by magnifying your ambitions until they consume your judgment. The Balrog has no ambitions. The Balrog has no desires. The Balrog is a creature of fire and darkness that has been sleeping under a mountain for 6,000 years, and the only thing it wants, if it wants anything at all, is to be left alone. Think about what the ring could offer the Balrog. Power? The Balrog already has power. Devastating, Maya-level, fortress-destroying power. Territory? The Balrog already has territory. The entire deep kingdom of Khazad-dûm, thousands of halls and chambers and tunnels, a domain larger than most surface kingdoms. Status? The Balrog does not recognize status. The Balrog does not care about hierarchies or titles or positions of authority. The Balrog burned those concerns away millennia ago, along with everything else that connected it to the social world of thinking beings. The ring has nothing to offer. The ring's hook is desire, and the Balrog has no desire to hook. The ring's lever is ambition, and the Balrog has no ambition to lever. The ring's weapon is temptation, and the Balrog is beyond temptation, not because the Balrog is virtuous, but because the Balrog is empty. You cannot tempt a void. You cannot bribe a fire. You cannot offer something to a creature that wants nothing. You cannot dominate a creature that has no desires to exploit. You cannot bribe a creature that has no needs to fulfill. You cannot threaten a creature that does not fear death. The ring's power of domination is useless against a being that has no psychological leverage, no ambitions to magnify, no fears to exploit, no weaknesses to target. Part 14. The practical problems. Even if Sauron had the theoretical authority to command the Balrog, which, as we have established, he did not, there are enormous practical problems with the idea of deploying the Balrog in the War of the Ring. Problem 1. The Balrog is in Moria. Moria is under the Misty Mountains, hundreds of miles north of Mordor, separated from Sauron's territory by the full width of Rohan and the eastern banks of the Anduin. Getting the Balrog from Moria to the battlefields of the war would require the Balrog to travel overland, through territory controlled by the enemy, past the watchtowers of Gondor, through regions where its presence would be detected and where the forces of the Free Peoples might attempt to intercept it. A Balrog is not subtle. A Balrog is a being of fire and shadow, a creature that burns everything it touches, that radiates heat and darkness, that cannot move through the countryside without leaving a trail of devastation visible for miles. The march of a Balrog from Moria to Mordor would be the most conspicuous military movement in the history of the Third Age. Every scout, every ranger, every watchman in the northern reaches of Middle-earth would know that the creature was moving. Problem 2. The Balrog is difficult to transport. You cannot put a Balrog on a horse. You cannot load a Balrog onto a wagon. You cannot send a Balrog through a secret passage or disguise it as a merchant. The Balrog is what it is, a towering inferno of flame and shadow, a being that sets fire to everything around it, a creature that cannot be concealed or contained or redirected once it starts moving. Moving a Balrog is like moving a wildfire. You can start it, but you cannot control where it goes. Problem 3. The Balrog might not go where Sauron wants it to go. Even if the Balrog agreed to leave Moria, there is no guarantee that it would march to the Pelennor Fields or the Black Gate or wherever Sauron wanted it. The Balrog has been masterless for 6,000 years. It has not taken orders. It has not followed a chain of command. It has not operated within a military structure. The Balrog is feral, a creature that has reverted to a state of independence that makes it unpredictable, unreliable, and potentially dangerous to its own side. A feral Balrog on a battlefield is as likely to burn Sauron's orcs as it is to burn the enemy. The Balrog does not distinguish between friend and foe. It does not recognize Sauron's forces as allies. It burns. That is what it does. It destroys. And the destruction is indiscriminate, not because the Balrog is stupid, but because the Balrog has lost the capacity for the kind of coordinated, purposeful destruction that military operations require. Part 15. The example of Gandalf. The encounter between Gandalf and the Balrog on the bridge of Khazad Diem gives us critical evidence about the Balrog's nature. Evidence that supports the argument that the Balrog was not under Sauron's control and could not have been deployed as a weapon. When the Fellowship enters Moria, the Balrog attacks them. Not because Sauron ordered the attack, not because the Balrog is serving Sauron's strategic interests. The Balrog attacks because the Fellowship has entered its territory, because the noise and the light and the presence of living beings in the halls of Moria have disturbed the creature's long slumber and triggered the aggressive response of a territorial predator. The Balrog's attack is not strategic. It is reactive. The Balrog does not target Frodo. The Balrog does not attempt to seize the ring. The Balrog does not coordinate with the orcs who are also attacking the Fellowship. The Balrog acts on its own, driven by rage, by the instinct to destroy, by the ancient, Morgoth-implanted impulse toward violence that fires in the presence of perceived intruders. Consider how differently the encounter would have played out if the Balrog had been operating under Sauron's direction. A Sauron-directed Balrog would not have charged up from the deeps in a blind rage. A Sauron-directed Balrog would have targeted Frodo, the Ring-bearer, the most important individual in Middle-earth at that moment. A Sauron-directed Balrog would have ignored the other members of the Fellowship and focused all of its devastating power on capturing the Hobbit and recovering the ring. A Sauron-directed Balrog would have used the orcs as a coordinated screen, driving the Fellowship into a trap cutting off the exits, herding Frodo toward the deep places where the Balrog could take the ring in darkness. None of this happens. The Balrog does not target Frodo. The Balrog does not use the orcs. The Balrog does not execute anything resembling a plan. The Balrog rises from the deep and attacks everything in front of it with the undiscriminating fury of a territorial predator. The behavior is instinctive, not strategic. The behavior is reactive, not planned. The behavior is the behavior of a creature acting alone, on its own impulses, without direction from any external authority. If the Balrog were serving Sauron, it would have acted differently. If the Balrog had been receiving instructions from Mordor, it would have known about the ring. It would have known about Frodo. It would have known that the small hobbit in the grey cloak was carrying the most important object in the world, and it would have prioritized the capture of the ring above all else. But the Balrog does not prioritize the ring. The Balrog does not even seem to know about the ring. The Balrog charges up from the deeps and attacks everything in sight, with the undirected, uncoordinated fury of a creature that is acting on instinct rather than intelligence. The Balrog's behavior in Moria is the behavior of a wild animal defending its den, not the behavior of a military asset executing a mission. The Balrog kills Gandalf because Gandalf stands in its way, not because Sauron ordered Gandalf's death. The Balrog fights because fighting is what Balrogs do, not because the fight serves Sauron's strategic objectives. Gandalf's response confirms this reading. Gandalf does not treat the Balrog as Sauron's agent. Gandalf treats the Balrog as an independent threat, a danger that exists apart from the war, apart from Sauron's plans, apart from the strategic calculations that govern the rest of the conflict. The Balrog is its own problem, and Gandalf deals with it as its own problem, sacrificing himself to destroy the creature, not as an act of war against Sauron, but as an act of necessity against a threat that has nothing to do with Sauron. Part 16. The two types of darkness. There is a distinction in Tolkien's work that is easy to miss, but that is essential to understanding the Balrog's relationship to Sauron. A distinction between two types of darkness, two modes of evil, two ways in which corruption manifests in the world. The first type is Morgoth's darkness. Morgoth's evil is nihilistic. It is the evil of destruction for its own sake, the desire to unmake, to ruin, to reduce the beautiful to the ugly and the ordered to the chaotic. Morgoth hated the world because the world was not his. He hated the creations of the other Valar because they were not his creations. He hated the light because the light revealed the beauty of a world that he could not control. Morgoth's evil was the evil of the arsonist, the evil of the being who burns the house down because he cannot own it. The Balrogs are creatures of this darkness. They are fire spirits, beings whose nature is oriented toward burning, destroying, consuming. The Balrogs do not build. They do not create. They do not organize or administer or strategize. They burn. They are the purest expression of Morgoth's nihilistic impulse, the desire to destroy, incarnated in fire and shadow. The second type is Sauron's darkness. Sauron's evil is not nihilistic. It is authoritarian. Sauron does not want to destroy the world. He wants to control it. Sauron wants order, his order, imposed on every living thing, governing every will, regulating every action. Sauron's ideal world is not a wasteland. It is a machine, a perfectly ordered, perfectly controlled, perfectly obedient system in which every creature serves its designated purpose and every action serves Sauron's will. The difference between Morgoth's darkness and Sauron's darkness is the difference between an arsonist and a tyrant. The arsonist wants to burn the house down. The tyrant wants to own the house and everything in it. The arsonist destroys. The tyrant controls. Both are evil. But the evils are different in kind, and the creatures produced by each evil are different in kind. The Balrog is a creature of Morgoth's darkness. The Balrog burns. The Balrog destroys. The Balrog is fire without purpose, violence without strategy, destruction without design. The Balrog is useless to Sauron not because it is weak, but because it is wrong. It is the wrong kind of evil. Sauron needs servants who can be controlled. The Balrog cannot be controlled. Sauron needs instruments that serve a purpose. The Balrog's purpose is destruction. And destruction without direction is not a military asset. It is a liability. Part 17. What would have happened? Let me indulge the hypothetical for a moment. What would have happened if Sauron had somehow managed to deploy the Balrog in the War of the Ring? Scenario 1. The Balrog at Helm's Deep. Imagine the Balrog arriving at Helm's Deep during the battle, a being of fire and shadow, towering over the fortress walls, burning through the deeping wall, incinerating the defenders with a single sweep of its flaming whip. The battle would have been over in minutes. The Rohirrim had no defense against a Balrog. The walls of Helm's Deep, however strong against orcs and Uruk-hai, were not built to withstand a mire of fire. The fortress would have burned. The defenders would have died. Thodin, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, all of them consumed by the fire of a creature that was beyond their power to resist. But there is a catch. If the Balrog had fought at Helm's Deep, Gandalf would not have gone to Helm's Deep. Gandalf would have gone wherever the Balrog was, because Gandalf was the only being in the Fellowship with the power to confront a Balrog. Gandalf would have redirected the entire war effort to deal with the Balrog, because the Balrog would have been the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. And Gandalf, having already killed the Balrog once, would have known how to fight it. The battle on Ziraxagil, the 10-day fight between Gandalf and Durin's Bane, from the lowest dungeon to the highest peak, would have given Gandalf the knowledge and the experience to confront the creature again. The outcome would not have been certain, but the confrontation would have happened, and the confrontation would have pulled Gandalf away from his other responsibilities, away from the strategic coordination of the war, away from the guidance of Thodin and the counsel of Aragorn. There is an additional complication that most people overlook. The Balrog at Helm's Deep would have been fighting in the open air. The Balrog that Gandalf fought in Moria was in its element, underground, in the dark, in the enclosed spaces where its fire illuminated the world and its shadow filled the corridors. A Balrog on the surface, under the open sky, is a different creature. The sky diminishes the Balrog's psychological impact. The open air dissipates the enclosed, suffocating terror that the Balrog projects in tunnels and caverns. The Balrog is a creature of the deep. On the surface, the creature is out of its element, still powerful, still devastating, but stripped of the atmospheric advantage that makes the Balrog a figure of absolute, primal, claustrophobic horror. The Rohirrim at Helm's Deep were already fighting against overwhelming odds. The addition of a Balrog would have changed the arithmetic, but not the calculus. The men who were willing to die defending the fortress would not have broken at the sight of a fire demon. They were already facing 10,000 Uruk-hai, already staring at the certainty of death, already operating in the zone beyond fear, where the mortal courage that Tolkien celebrates most brightly burns its brightest. The Balrog might have killed them faster, but it would not have killed their spirit. The deployment of the Balrog would have created as many problems for Sauron as it solved. The Balrog would have killed defenders, yes, but it would also have drawn Gandalf, the most dangerous strategic mind on the other side, to the specific location where the Balrog was fighting. And Gandalf, unlike the defenders, could not be burned. Part 18. Scenario 2. The Pelennor. Scenario 2. The Balrog at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. This is the scenario that most fans imagine when they think about the question, the Balrog appearing on the Pelennor, marching toward the gates of Minas Tirith, burning through the armies of Gondor and Rohan like a forest fire through dry brush. The Balrog would have been devastating. The Pelennor is an open field. No walls, no choke points, no defensive positions that could have sheltered the defenders from the Balrog's fire. The Rohirrim, who turned the tide of the battle with their cavalry charge, would have been helpless against the creature. Horses would have bolted. Men would have burned. The charge of the Riders of Rohan, one of the most iconic moments in all of Tolkien, would have ended in a wall of flame. But the Pelennor was already going well for Sauron. The Pelennor was already a battle that Sauron was winning, before Aragorn arrived with the ships, before the dead men of Dunharrow swept through the Corsairs, before the reinforcements from the southern fiefdoms turned the tide. The Pelennor was a battle that Sauron was going to win through conventional means, through numbers, through force, through the overwhelming application of military power. The Balrog would have been overkill. And overkill comes with risks. A Balrog on the Pelennor would have been as dangerous to Sauron's own forces as it was to the enemy. The Balrog does not distinguish between Gondorian soldiers and Mordor orcs. The Balrog burns, and the burning, in the close-quarters chaos of a battlefield, would have consumed Sauron's troops as readily as Gondor's. There is also the problem of the Witch King. The Witch King of Angmar was Sauron's commander on the Pelennor, the captain of the Dark Lord's forces, the supreme military authority on the battlefield. The Witch King's authority derived from Sauron's authority, channeled through the ring and the Nazgul's bond to the Dark Lord. The Witch King could command the orcs, the trolls, the Easterlings, the Corsairs. But could the Witch King command a Balrog? Almost certainly not. The Witch King was a man who had been enslaved by a ring, a man who had been transformed into a wraith, a man who served Sauron through the mechanism of domination. The Witch King's power, however great, was derivative, borrowed from Sauron, channeled through the ring, dependent on the Dark Lord's will. The Witch King did not have the spiritual standing to command a Maya. The Balrog would have looked at the Witch King the way a tiger looks at a house cat, with indifference. Part 19. Scenario 3. The Black Gate. The most interesting hypothetical is the one that never gets discussed, the Balrog at the Black Gate. The Battle of the Black Gate was the final stand of the Free Peoples, 7,000 soldiers marching to the gates of Mordor, not to win but to die. The purpose of the battle was not victory, it was distraction. The army of the West was throwing itself against the Black Gate to draw Sauron's eye away from Frodo and Sam, who were crawling across the plains of Gorgoroth toward Mount Doom. If a Balrog had appeared at the Black Gate, the battle would have ended before it began. 7,000 soldiers cannot fight a Maya. The army of the West, Aragorn, Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli. The soldiers of Gondor and Rohan would have faced a creature that was beyond their collective power to defeat. The diversion would have failed. The eye would not have been drawn. And Frodo and Sam, still struggling through Mordor, would have been exposed to the full scrutiny of Sauron's surveillance apparatus. But here is the deeper problem. A Balrog at the Black Gate would have been redundant. Sauron already had overwhelming force at the Black Gate. The armies of Mordor outnumbered the army of the West by a ratio of at least 10-1. The Nazgul were circling overhead. The trolls were advancing. The orcs were swarming. The battle was unwinnable for the Free Peoples by any conventional measure, and the addition of a Balrog would not have changed the outcome. What the Balrog would have changed is the symbolism. The Battle of the Black Gate was not about winning. It was about standing. It was about the 7,000 choosing to face the darkness and refusing to break. Choosing death over surrender, choosing to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. The presence of a Balrog would not have changed this choice. The men who were willing to die fighting orcs would have been willing to die fighting a Balrog. The courage that brought them to the Black Gate was not contingent on the specific nature of the threat. It was the courage of the doomed, the courage that exists precisely because hope is gone. Part 20. The strategic mind of Sauron. Let us set aside the hypotheticals and return to the strategic reality of Sauron's position during the War of the Ring. Because the question of the Balrog is, ultimately, a question about Sauron's strategic thinking. And Sauron's strategic thinking is more sophisticated than most fans give it credit for. Sauron is not stupid. Sauron is not impulsive. Sauron is not the kind of villain who throws everything at the enemy and hopes for the best. Sauron is a planner, a meticulous, patient, long-term thinker who builds his strategies around reliable instruments and predictable outcomes. The Balrog is not a reliable instrument. The Balrog is not a predictable outcome. The Balrog is a wild card, a creature of immense power but uncertain loyalty, unpredictable behavior, and no history of operating within Sauron's command structure. Deploying the Balrog would have been like deploying a tornado, devastating, yes, but impossible to aim. Sauron's military strategy during the War of the Ring is based on control. Sauron controls his armies through a hierarchy of command. The Nazgul at the top, the orc captains beneath them, the rank-and-file soldiers at the bottom. Every element of Sauron's military machine is integrated into this hierarchy. Every unit knows its orders. Every commander knows the chain of authority. The system is designed for coordinated, purposeful, directed action, for the kind of military operation that wins wars, rather than the kind of chaotic violence that wins battles but loses campaigns. The Balrog does not fit into this system. The Balrog cannot be integrated into a command hierarchy. The Balrog does not take orders from Nazgul. The Balrog does not coordinate with orc captains. The Balrog is a solitary agent of destruction, powerful, yes, but uncontrollable, unpredictable, and fundamentally incompatible with the kind of organized military campaign that Sauron is running. Sauron does not need the Balrog. This is the simplest version of the answer. Sauron's military position during the War of the Ring is strong enough to win without the Balrog. The armies of Mordor are vast. The Nazgul are powerful. The allies, the Easterlings, the Haradrim, the Corsairs are numerous. The strategic situation favors Sauron overwhelmingly. The addition of a single Balrog, however powerful, would not significantly alter the balance of forces, and the risks of deploying an uncontrollable weapon would outweigh the marginal military benefit. Part 21. The geography of isolation. There is a geographical dimension to the Balrog question that is worth exploring, because the geography of Middle-earth creates practical barriers to the Balrog's deployment that are independent of the political and theological issues we have discussed. Moria is in the Misty Mountains, in the central range that divides the western and eastern halves of Middle-earth. The Misty Mountains are a significant obstacle to east-west movement. The mountains are high, snow-covered, riddled with orc tunnels, and crossed by only a few passable routes: the High Pass in the north, the Redhorn Pass, and the Gap of Rohan in the south. Sauron's power base is in Mordor, in the southeast of Middle-earth, separated from the Misty Mountains by the full breadth of Rohan and the river Anduin. The distance between Moria and Mordor is roughly 500 miles as the crow flies, and significantly more by any practical overland route. For the Balrog to reach Sauron's battlefields, it would have to cross this distance. It would have to emerge from Moria, descend the eastern slopes of the Misty Mountains, cross the plains of Rohan, ford the Anduin, and march through the territories of Gondor to reach the Pelennor Fields or the Black Gate. This march would take weeks. During those weeks, the Balrog would be visible, a towering pillar of fire and shadow moving across the open countryside, burning everything in its path. The Free Peoples would see the Balrog coming. They would have time to prepare. They would have time to redirect Gandalf to intercept the creature before it reached the battlefield. The march would also be destructive, not to the enemy, but to the countryside that Sauron is trying to conquer. The Balrog's fire would burn the fields and the farms and the forests that Sauron wants to rule. The devastation would be indiscriminate, a path of destruction that would leave Sauron's conquered territory scarred and useless. Sauron does not want a wasteland. Sauron wants an empire. A Balrog marching through his future dominion is a Balrog destroying the thing he is fighting to possess. Part 22. The Orcs of Moria. There is a complication to the straightforward narrative that Sauron could not control the Balrog, and the complication is the Orcs. Sauron had Orcs in Moria. These Orcs were, in many cases, acting on instructions that originated from Mordor. The Orc chieftain Azog had connections to Sauron's broader network. The goblins of the Misty Mountains cooperated with Sauron's forces during the War of the Ring. The Orcs who attacked the Fellowship in Moria were, in at least some interpretations, acting under Sauron's general direction. How does this square with the claim that Sauron could not control the Balrog? The answer is that the Orcs and the Balrog coexisted in Moria without the Balrog being subordinate to the Orcs or to the power that commanded the Orcs. The relationship was not hierarchical. It was territorial. The Balrog occupied the deep places, the lowest levels, the bottommost chambers, the places where the dwarves had delved their deepest and where the fire burned the hottest. The Orcs occupied the upper levels, the halls, the corridors, the passages that connected Moria to the outside world. The two populations did not mix. The Orcs avoided the deep places. The Balrog stayed in the deep places. The arrangement was not a collaboration. It was an uneasy cohabitation. Two predators sharing a territory, each staying in its own zone, each aware of the other's presence, but not interacting. The Orcs feared the Balrog. This is evident from the text. The Orcs in Moria are terrified of the creature in the depths. The Orcs do not summon the Balrog to help them fight the Fellowship. The Balrog rises on its own, disturbed by the noise, attracted by the light, triggered by the intrusion. The Orcs do not command the Balrog any more than Sauron commands the Balrog. The Orcs endure the Balrog. They live in its shadow. They benefit from its presence. But they do not control it. This cohabitation is the model for the broader relationship between Sauron and the Balrog. Sauron and the Balrog occupy the same world. They share the same darkness. They descend from the same master. But they do not serve each other. They coexist, the way two predators coexist in overlapping territories, wary of each other, aware of each other, but not subordinate to each other. Part 23. The Dol Guldur Connection. There is one more piece of evidence that illuminates the relationship between Sauron and the creatures of Moria, and it comes from Sauron's time in Dol Guldur. Before Sauron returned to Mordor, he spent centuries in Dol Guldur, the fortress in southern Mirkwood, within reach of Moria across the Vale of the Anduin. For hundreds of years, Sauron was the Balrog's nearest dark neighbour. He was close enough to have made contact. He was close enough to have sent emissaries. He was close enough to have attempted to recruit the creature, and as far as we can tell, he did not. Or if he did, the recruitment failed. Sauron spent centuries within striking distance of one of the most powerful creatures in Middle-earth, and he left it alone. He built his own power base. He gathered his own allies. He bred his own armies. He developed his own instruments of control. He did everything that a rising Dark Lord would do to prepare for the reconquest of Middle-earth. Everything except recruit the Balrog. The absence of recruitment is telling. Sauron is not the kind of being who overlooks useful assets. Sauron is not the kind of strategist who ignores available resources. If the Balrog had been recruitable, if there had been any realistic prospect of bringing the creature under Sauron's control, Sauron would have done it. The fact that he did not suggests that Sauron knew from experience or from analysis that the Balrog could not be recruited, that the effort would fail, that the creature under the mountains was beyond his reach, beyond his influence, beyond his power to command. Sauron knew his limitations. This is one of the things that makes Sauron a formidable villain, his capacity for realistic self-assessment, his willingness to work within the constraints of his actual capabilities rather than overreaching into the territory of his ambitions. Sauron knew that he could not command the Balrog. So Sauron did not try. He built his empire without the Balrog, using the tools he could control, the instruments he could trust, the servants whose obedience he could guarantee. Part 24. The deeper theology. The Balrog question points to something deeper, something that goes beyond the military strategy of the War of the Ring and into the theological foundations of Tolkien's world. Tolkien was a Catholic. His understanding of evil was shaped by Catholic theology, by the idea that evil is not a substance but a privation, not a thing but the absence of a thing, not a positive force but a corruption of a good force. Evil in Tolkien's world does not create. Evil corrupts. Evil takes what is good and twists it, bends it, distorts it into something that serves the purposes of destruction rather than the purposes of creation. The Balrogs are the purest expression of this theology. The Balrogs were Maiar, good spirits, creative spirits, beings who participated in the shaping of the world. And then they were corrupted, twisted by Morgoth's influence into creatures of fire and destruction, beings whose nature was reversed, whose creative impulse was turned into a destructive impulse, whose light was replaced by shadow. The corruption is the point. The Balrogs are evil not because they were made evil, but because they were made good and then corrupted. The fire that writhes around them is the fire of their original nature, the fire of the divine creative spirit, turned inside out, transformed from the fire that warms and illuminates into the fire that burns and destroys. Sauron's corruption is different. Sauron was corrupted by the same master, but the corruption took a different form. Sauron was not turned into a creature of destruction. Sauron was turned into a creature of control. Sauron's corrupted impulse is not the impulse to burn, but the impulse to dominate, to impose order, to control wills, to build systems of authority that place Sauron at the center of everything. The two corruptions, the destructive and the controlling, are incompatible. A creature of destruction cannot be controlled by a creature of control, because the act of destruction resists the imposition of order. A Balrog burns everything, including the systems of authority that a Sauron-type evil depends on. The Balrog is anarchic. Sauron is authoritarian. The anarchist and the authoritarian cannot work together, because the anarchist destroys the structures that the authoritarian builds. This incompatibility runs deeper than most fans realize. Consider what Sauron's ideal world looks like. A perfectly ordered empire, every creature in its assigned place, every action serving Sauron's will, every corner of Middle-earth functioning according to Sauron's design. Now place a Balrog in this world. The Balrog does not serve. The Balrog does not obey. The Balrog does not recognize the authority of Sauron's system. The Balrog burns the system. The Balrog is, by its very nature, the antithesis of what Sauron is trying to build. A creature of chaos inhabiting an empire of order. A fire burning inside a machine. Sauron cannot tolerate the Balrog any more than he can use the Balrog. The Balrog's existence is an affront to Sauron's project, a visible, flaming, undeniable proof that Sauron's order is not universal, that Sauron's authority is not absolute, that there exist creatures in Middle-earth who do not submit, and cannot be made to submit. The Balrog is the exception to the rule, and Sauron's entire project depends on there being no exceptions. Part 25. The Lesson of the First Age. The incompatibility between destructive evil and controlling evil was already visible in the First Age, in the relationship between Morgoth and his own servants. Morgoth, despite being the supreme power of evil in the Elder Days, had a problem. His instruments of destruction were often self-defeating. The dragons burned his own territory. The Balrogs destroyed his own fortresses. The unleashing of destructive forces created chaos that undermined Morgoth's ability to consolidate his gains and to administer the territories he conquered. The War of Wrath is the ultimate example. The Valar's assault on Angband provoked Morgoth to unleash his most destructive forces, the dragons, the Balrogs, the full arsenal of destructive power that he had accumulated over the centuries. And the result was the destruction of Beleriand, the sinking of an entire continent. The devastation of the land that Morgoth had spent the entire First Age fighting to control. Morgoth's destructive forces destroyed the thing he was fighting for. The instruments of destruction consumed the prize. Sauron learned from this. Sauron, the chief lieutenant, the being who had watched Morgoth's empire collapse under the weight of its own destructive power, drew a lesson. Unchecked destruction is self-defeating. The Dark Lord who unleashes forces he cannot control will eventually be consumed by those forces. The path to lasting power is not destruction, but domination. Not the burning of the world, but the control of the world. Not the Balrog's fire, but the ring's chain. The ring is Sauron's answer to the Balrog. The ring does not burn. The ring does not destroy. The ring controls. The ring is the antithesis of the Balrog, the instrument of order rather than the instrument of chaos, the tool of domination rather than the weapon of destruction. Sauron chose the ring over the Balrog because the ring is the kind of power that builds empires, and the Balrog is the kind of power that destroys them. The choice is revealing because it tells us what kind of evil Sauron is, and what kind of evil Sauron is not. Sauron is not Morgoth. Sauron does not want to destroy the world. Sauron wants to own the world. The distinction is crucial, and it explains every strategic decision Sauron makes during the War of the Ring, including the decision not to deploy the Balrog. Every time Sauron makes a strategic choice, he chooses control over chaos. He sends the Nazgul, not the Balrog. He uses the Palantri, not brute force. He corrupts Saruman through manipulation, not through fire. He attacks Gondor with an organized army, not with a natural disaster. Sauron's war is a precision instrument designed to conquer, to subjugate, to bring the free peoples under Sauron's authority without destroying the world that Sauron wants to rule. The Balrog is the opposite of precision. The Balrog is the blunt instrument, the weapon that destroys everything, the fire that burns without discrimination, the force that cannot be aimed or calibrated or restrained. Sauron does not deploy the blunt instrument because the blunt instrument undermines the precision that Sauron's campaign requires. You cannot conquer a world that you have burned to ash. You cannot rule a kingdom that you have reduced to cinders. The Balrog is incompatible with Sauron's objectives, not because the Balrog is weak, but because the Balrog is too destructive for a Dark Lord who wants to dominate rather than destroy. Part 26. The Balrog as relic. The Balrog of Moria is, in the deepest sense, a relic. A remnant of an older, more primitive, more brutal form of evil that the world has moved beyond. The First Age was the age of Morgoth, the age of nihilistic destruction, of the Balrogs and the dragons and the sacking of elvish kingdoms. The evil of the First Age was hot, immediate, theatrical, fire and shadow, whips and swords, the direct, personal, face-to-face destruction of everything beautiful. The Third Age is the age of Sauron, the age of calculated domination, of the rings and the Nazgul and the slow corruption of free peoples through manipulation and control. The evil of the Third Age is cold, indirect, systemic, rings and wraiths, spies and agents, the gradual, impersonal, bureaucratic subjugation of everything free. The Balrog does not belong to the Third Age. The Balrog is a creature of the First Age, a being whose nature was shaped by Morgoth's wars, whose purpose was defined by Morgoth's strategies, whose existence is a relic of a form of evil that the world has outgrown. The Balrog is an anachronism, a dinosaur in a world that has evolved past the conditions that produced it. Sauron's decision not to use the Balrog is, in this sense, a decision not to regress. Sauron has moved beyond Morgoth's methods. Sauron has evolved a more sophisticated, more sustainable, more effective form of evil. An evil that dominates rather than destroys, that builds rather than burns, that creates systems of control rather than unleashing forces of chaos. Using the Balrog would be a step backward, a reversion to the primitive, destructive, self-defeating methods that brought Morgoth to ruin. Part 27. The Gandalf Factor. There is one more reason that Sauron does not deploy the Balrog, a reason that is strategic rather than theological, practical rather than philosophical. Gandalf killed the Balrog. Gandalf, the Grey Pilgrim, the servant of the Valar, the Maya of Manwë who was sent to Middle-earth to oppose Sauron, fought the Balrog of Moria and destroyed it. The battle on Xiraxagil lasted 10 days. Gandalf and the Balrog fought from the lowest dungeon to the highest peak, through the roots of the mountain and up the endless stair, in a contest of fire and lightning that raged across the entire vertical extent of the Misty Mountains. And Gandalf won. This is staggering. A single Maya, sent to Middle-earth in the body of an old man, constrained by the Valar's mandate to operate within the limitations of mortal form, defeated one of Morgoth's elite warriors in single combat. The creature that had slain Durin the Six and driven the dwarves from their greatest kingdom was killed by a wizard who looked like somebody's grandfather. The battle itself deserves attention, because it tells us something about the limits of the Balrog's power that is relevant to the question of deployment. Gandalf fought the Balrog from the foundations of the earth to the peak of the mountain. The battle lasted 10 days. The two Maya were evenly matched, so evenly matched that the fight consumed them both, killing the Balrog and destroying Gandalf's physical body, leaving both of them broken on the mountaintop. The fact that the fight was this close, that a Maya in the body of an old man could match the fire-wreathed fury of one of Morgoth's elite warriors, tells us that the Balrog is not the invincible superweapon that fans often imagine. The Balrog is powerful, yes, the Balrog is terrifying, yes, but the Balrog can be fought. The Balrog can be matched. The Balrog can be killed by a single opponent of comparable spiritual standing. This significantly diminishes the Balrog's value as a strategic asset. A weapon that can be countered by a single enemy combatant is not a war-winning weapon. It is a duel-winning weapon, effective in a one-on-one contest, but vulnerable to the specific countermeasure that the enemy has available. And a countermeasure, in this case, is Gandalf. Sauron knows this. Sauron knows that Gandalf killed the Balrog. Sauron knows that Gandalf has returned from death, elevated from grey to white, endowed with greater power than he possessed before the battle. Sauron knows that the Balrog, for all its terrible power, is not invincible. That the creature can be fought, can be beaten, can be destroyed by a being of sufficient will and sufficient power. And Sauron knows that Gandalf is still out there. The wizard who killed the Balrog is still operating, advising kings, coordinating defenses, guiding the resistance. If Sauron deploys another Balrog, Gandalf will confront it. Gandalf will fight it. And Gandalf, who has already won this fight once, may well win it again. The Gandalf factor makes the deployment of a Balrog a wasting asset. The Balrog can be killed. The being who can kill it is already on the opposing side. Deploying the Balrog risks not only the creature's loss, but also the emboldening of the enemy, the demonstration, for the second time, that the ancient terrors of the First Age can be overcome by the courage and the power of the Free People's champions. Part 28. Why this question matters. The Balrog question is not a plot hole. I want to be very clear about this, because the question is often framed, especially in online discussions, as an oversight on Tolkien's part, a gap in the narrative, a failure of world building. It is none of these things. The Balrog question is a feature, not a bug. The fact that Sauron does not use the Balrog tells us something essential about the nature of evil in Tolkien's world, something that the story depends on, something that the resolution of the conflict requires. If evil could coordinate perfectly, if every dark power in Middle-earth could be unified under a single will, directed toward a single purpose, deployed with a single strategy, then evil would be invincible. The Free Peoples could not resist a unified darkness. The combined power of Sauron, the Balrog, the remaining dragons, the creatures of the deep, this combined power would be overwhelming. The Free Peoples would have no chance. But evil cannot coordinate. Evil is, by its nature, fractured, divided by competing ambitions, undermined by mutual distrust, weakened by the fundamental incompatibility of different forms of corruption. Sauron cannot command the Balrog, because Sauron's evil and the Balrog's evil are different evils, shaped by different impulses, oriented toward different goals, expressed through different methods. The darkness is not united. The darkness is, at the most fundamental level, divided against itself. This is one of Tolkien's deepest insights about the nature of evil. Evil cannot truly cooperate. Evil can coerce. Evil can dominate. Evil can force compliance through fear and violence. But evil cannot build genuine alliances, cannot sustain genuine partnerships, cannot create the kind of mutual trust and shared purpose that makes coordinated action possible. Evil is inherently selfish, inherently suspicious, inherently oriented toward the domination of others rather than the cooperation with others. And the selfishness and the suspicion and the drive to dominate make genuine cooperation impossible. The Balrog is the proof. The most powerful creature on Sauron's side of the map, a being of devastating combat capability, a weapon that could have changed the course of the war, sits unused under a mountain because the darkness cannot cooperate with itself. The Balrog does not serve Sauron because the Balrog does not serve anyone. The darkness has no teamwork. The darkness has only power. And power without cooperation is wasted. Part 29. The contrast with the free peoples, the inability of evil to cooperate, stands in sharp contrast to the defining quality of the free peoples. Their ability to form alliances, to build trust, to coordinate action across the boundaries of race and culture and history. The Fellowship of the Ring is the embodiment of this quality. 9 beings, drawn from 4 different races, carrying centuries of mutual hostility, burdened with personal grudges and cultural prejudices, come together and form a functioning team. They cooperate. They trust each other. They subordinate their individual goals to the collective purpose. They build the kind of shared commitment that makes coordinated action possible. Sauron cannot do this. Sauron cannot form a fellowship. Sauron cannot build a team of 9 beings who trust each other and work toward a common goal. Sauron can build an army, a structure of command, a hierarchy of domination, a machine of obedience. But he cannot build a fellowship, a community of free agents who choose to cooperate because they share a purpose and trust each other's commitment. The Balrog is the most dramatic illustration of this limitation. Sauron has a Maya-level asset, a creature of devastating power, a being that could have transformed the war. But Sauron cannot use it, because Sauron cannot build the relationship that would make the Balrog's cooperation possible. Sauron cannot form a partnership with the Balrog, because partnership requires trust. And trust requires the willingness to treat the other as an equal. And the willingness to treat the other as an equal is exactly the quality that evil, by its nature, lacks. The free peoples can do what evil cannot. Legolas and Gimli, an elf and a dwarf, members of races that have hated each other for millennia, become friends. They overcome the ancient enmity. They build a bond that is stronger than the hatred. They cooperate, not because they are forced to, but because they choose to. Because the shared purpose and the shared danger create a trust that transcends the old divisions. Sauron and the Balrog cannot do what Legolas and Gimli do. The Dark Maya and the fallen fire spirit cannot overcome their separation, cannot build the trust that cooperation requires, cannot form the partnership that would make the Balrog's power available to Sauron's strategy. The evil that divides the world also divides itself, and the division is the darkness's deepest weakness. Part 30. The Other Survivors. The Balrog was not the only surviving creature of Morgoth's dominion. There were others, other relics of the First Age, other remnants of the Dark Elder Days, scattered across Middle-earth in hiding places and forgotten lairs. The dragons are the most obvious example. Smaug, the great dragon of the Lonely Mountain, was a survivor of Morgoth's era, a creature bred in the Elder Days, carrying the fire and the malice of the original Dark Lord. Smaug was arguably more powerful than the Balrog, certainly more mobile, more intelligent, and more capable of independent strategic action. And Sauron did not use Smaug either. Smaug sat on his hoard under the Lonely Mountain for nearly 2 centuries, unrecruited, uncommanded, unintegrated into Sauron's war machine. Gandalf himself noted this, noted that Smaug was a potential asset that Sauron might try to use, and that the dragon's destruction by Bard was, in strategic terms, a relief. But Sauron never successfully deployed the dragon. The reason is the same. Smaug, like the Balrog, was a creature of Morgoth's darkness, a being of independent will, ancient power, and no inclination to serve a master it considered its inferior. Smaug was arrogant, territorial, and self-interested. Smaug served Smaug. The dragon's gold sickness, its obsessive attachment to the horde, its fierce independence, these qualities made Smaug as unrecruitable as the Balrog. Different psychology, same result. a creature of Morgoth's making that could not be brought under Sauron's control. The pattern tells us that the problem is not specific to the Balrog. The problem is systemic. All of Morgoth's surviving creatures share the same quality. They are too powerful, too independent, too deeply shaped by Morgoth's personal influence to serve a successor who lacks Morgoth's authority. The Balrog cannot be commanded. The dragons cannot be commanded. The creatures of the deep cannot be commanded. They are relics, powerful, dangerous, but ultimately unusable relics of a darkness that has passed. And this is, I think, one of the most haunting aspects of Sauron's position as Dark Lord. Sauron inherited Morgoth's legacy, the orcs, the corruption, the infrastructure of evil that Morgoth spent the entire First Age building. But Sauron did not inherit Morgoth's authority. The legacy came without the license. The tools came without the right to use them. Sauron received the inheritance, but not the power that made the inheritance functional. It is as if a general inherited an army, but not the loyalty of its officers. The soldiers are there. The weapons are there. The fortresses are there. But the officers, the powerful, autonomous, Maya-level beings who commanded the army's most devastating units, do not answer to the new general. They answered to the old one. And the old one is gone. And the new one, for all his ambition and his cunning and his terrible brilliance, cannot fill the void that the old one left. Sauron built his power despite this limitation, not because of it. The Dark Lord of the Third Age constructed his empire from scratch, using the materials that Morgoth left behind, yes, but designing a new architecture of domination that did not depend on the creatures he could not control. The rings, the Nazgul, the Eye, the new instruments of power, forged by Sauron's own hand, answering to Sauron's own will. Sauron built around the Balrog, not with the Balrog. And the building, for all its terrible effectiveness, left the most powerful relic of the old darkness sitting unused in the dark. Part 31. The Irony of Isolation. There is a bitter irony at the heart of the Balrog's story, an irony that speaks to the nature of evil and the fate of evil's servants. The Balrog served Morgoth with absolute, unquestioning, fire and shadow devotion. It was one of the Dark Lord's most loyal and most effective warriors. It fought in the great battles. It killed elven lords. It led the charges that broke the defenses of the free peoples. The Balrog gave everything to Morgoth, its will, its nature, its very identity as a Maya. The Balrog became fire and shadow in Morgoth's service, surrendering whatever it had been before, whatever beauty, whatever light, whatever creative potential it had possessed in the days when it was still among the faithful Maya. And Morgoth abandoned it. When Morgoth fell, the Balrog was left behind, discarded, forgotten, a tool that had outlived its usefulness. Morgoth did not protect the Balrog. Morgoth did not provide for the Balrog's survival. Morgoth did not ensure that the Balrog would be cared for or guided or given a purpose in the master's absence. Morgoth fell, and the Balrog was left in the wreckage, alone, purposeless, with nothing to show for millennia of service except the darkness that consumed it and the fire that burned without warmth. This is the fate of evil servants. Evil uses. Evil consumes. Evil extracts everything from its followers and gives nothing back. Morgoth took the Balrog's nature, took its identity, took its capacity for anything other than destruction, and then, when Morgoth fell, the Balrog was left with nothing. No master, no purpose, no future. Just the fire and the shadow, burning in the dark forever. The irony deepens when you consider that the Balrog's loyalty was rewarded with abandonment. while Gandalf's humility was rewarded with resurrection. Gandalf, the Maya who confessed fear, who admitted weakness, who served with humility rather than with fire, was killed by the Balrog and sent back by the Valar, elevated, empowered, given a second chance. The Balrog, the Maya who served with absolute devotion, who gave everything to its master, who burned with the fires of commitment, was killed by Gandalf and was not sent back, was not elevated, was not given a second chance, was simply gone. The servant of light is renewed. The servant of darkness is consumed. The contrast is not accidental. It is the moral architecture of Tolkien's universe, the principle that service to good is rewarded with restoration, while service to evil is punished with annihilation. And the principle extends beyond the Balrog. Look at every servant of evil in Tolkien's work. Sauron himself is the supreme example. The Maya who served Morgoth with brilliant, capable, strategically indispensable devotion, and who was rewarded for that devotion with diminishment. Every defeat costs Sauron more. Every rebuilding leaves him weaker. Every cycle of fall and return strips away another layer of his original nature. Sauron began as one of the greatest of the Maiar, a spirit of all the smith, gifted with the intelligence and the craftsmanship that made him the most capable servant in Morgoth's court. By the end of the Third Age, Sauron cannot even take physical form. He is an eye, a lidless, sleepless, formless remnant of the being he once was, pouring his dwindling power into the ring and the war, spending himself on the campaign to conquer a world that he can no longer physically inhabit. The Witch King follows the same pattern, a king of men, presumably a great king, a king of power and authority and dignity, reduced by service to Sauron to a wraith, a screaming spectre on a winged beast, a hollow creature whose original identity has been so completely consumed by the ring's domination that nothing remains of the man he was. The Balrog follows the same pattern at an even deeper level. A Maya, presumably a being of beauty and creative power. A spirit who participated in the shaping of the world, reduced by service to Morgoth to a creature of fire and shadow. A being whose identity has been so completely consumed by the corruption that nothing remains but the destruction. The Balrog is the ultimate expression of evil's economy, total investment, total return, and the return is annihilation. Morgoth's servants gave everything, and they received in return exactly what evil always gives its servants. Nothing. Part 32. The symbolic dimension. The Balrog serves a symbolic function in The Lord of the Rings that is independent of its strategic value, and understanding this symbolic function helps explain why Tolkien placed the Balrog where he did, and why the creature's role in the story is shaped as it is. The Balrog is a test. It is the test that Gandalf must pass, the ordeal that the wizard must undergo in order to be transformed from Gandalf the Grey into Gandalf the White. The Balrog is the crucible. The Balrog is the fire through which Gandalf must walk in order to be reforged, re-empowered, resent to Middle-earth with the authority and the capability that the final stage of the mission requires. If the Balrog had been deployed elsewhere, if the creature had been marching with Sauron's armies at Helm's Deep or the Pelennor, the narrative function would have been lost. The Balrog needs to be in Moria. The Balrog needs to be encountered by the Fellowship in the darkness under the mountains. The Balrog needs to confront Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad Diem, because the confrontation is the mechanism of Gandalf's transformation, the death that leads to resurrection, the fall that leads to elevation, the sacrifice that leads to renewal. Tolkien understood this. The placement of the Balrog in Moria is not arbitrary. It is theologically precise. The Balrog is in the place where the Balrog needs to be, not for Sauron's purposes, but for the story's purposes. The story requires Gandalf to die and be reborn. The story requires the grey to become white. The story requires the old wizard to pass through the fire and come out the other side as something greater. And the Balrog is the fire. The Balrog is the crucible. The Balrog is the death that makes the rebirth possible. Consider the alternative. If Tolkien had placed the Balrog on the Pelennor, the creature would have been just another monster. One more terrifying enemy in a battle full of terrifying enemies. The Pelennor has the Witch King. The Pelennor has the Makil. The Pelennor has the trolls and the orcs and the Haradrim. Adding a Balrog to the Pelennor would have been adding spectacle to a battle that already has plenty of spectacle. The Balrog would have been diluted, reduced from a singular mythological horror to one item in a catalogue of horrors. In Moria, the Balrog is singular. In Moria, the Balrog is the only threat. In Moria, the encounter between Gandalf and the creature is not a battle among battles, but the battle, the defining confrontation, the pivotal moment, the hinge on which the entire story turns. The Balrog's narrative purpose is not military, it is spiritual. The Balrog is not in the story to be a weapon. The Balrog is in the story to be a threshold, a barrier that must be crossed, a challenge that must be met, a darkness that must be overcome in order for the light to emerge in its fullest form. This is why the Balrog is in Moria rather than on the Pelennor. The Pelennor is a battlefield. Moria is a tomb. The Pelennor is a place of war. Moria is a place of death and rebirth. The Balrog belongs in Moria because the Balrog's role in the story is not to fight a war, but to facilitate a transformation. And the transformation requires the specific conditions that Moria provides: darkness, depth, the passage through the earth from the world above to the world below and back again. Part 33. The Bridge. The Bridge of Khazad Diem is one of the most iconic images in all of fantasy, and the image tells us everything we need to know about the Balrog's nature and its relationship to the world above. The bridge is narrow. It spans a chasm. On one side is the Fellowship, the company of the free peoples, carrying the ring, moving toward the exit, heading for the daylight. On the other side is the Balrog, the creature of fire and shadow rising from the depths, advancing through the darkness. Gandalf stands on the bridge. He plants his staff. He faces the Balrog and speaks the words that echo through the history of fantasy literature: "You shall not pass." The image is a boundary. The bridge is a threshold between two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead, the world of light and the world of darkness, the world above and the world below. Gandalf is the gatekeeper. He stands on the boundary and prevents the darkness from crossing, prevents the creature of the deep from rising into the world above, prevents the relic of the First Age from entering the story of the Third Age. The moment is the most iconic in the entire Lord of the Rings, and it deserves its iconic status not just for the drama of the confrontation, but for the truth that the confrontation embodies. This is the moment when two ages collide. This is the moment when the ancient darkness of Morgoth's era, preserved, sleeping, burning in the deep, meets the current darkness of Sauron's era and finds that the two darknesses cannot connect. The Balrog rises from below. Gandalf stands above. And between them, on the narrow bridge, in the gap between the rising fire and the standing wizard, the two ages face each other across a chasm that neither can cross. The bridge breaks. Gandalf falls. The Balrog falls. The two Maiar plunge into the abyss together, into the deep, into the water, into the darkness below the bridge. And the falling is the answer. The bridge cannot hold. The connection between the old darkness and the new darkness cannot be maintained. The two ages cannot be joined. The relic and the present cannot be united. The bridge breaks because the gap between Sauron's evil and the Balrog's evil is too wide to span. The bridge is also, I think, a metaphor for the question we have been exploring. Why didn't Sauron use the Balrog? Because the Balrog cannot cross the bridge. The Balrog cannot pass from its world, the world of Morgoth's darkness, the world of nihilistic destruction, the world of fire without purpose, into Sauron's world, the world of calculated domination, the world of control and order and strategic deployment. The bridge is the gap between two forms of evil. Gandalf's stand on the bridge prevents the Balrog from crossing. But even without Gandalf, the Balrog could not cross. Because the gap is not physical, but metaphysical. The Balrog belongs to a different age, a different darkness, a different form of evil. The bridge that separates the Balrog from the world above is the bridge that separates Morgoth's evil from Sauron's evil. And the bridge cannot be crossed, because the two evils are fundamentally incompatible. Part 34. The fire that burns without purpose. Let me return to the image of fire, because fire is the key to understanding the Balrog, and the key to understanding why the Balrog is useless to Sauron. The Balrog's fire is real. It is not a metaphor. The creature burns with actual flame. Flame that produces heat, that consumes material, that chars the stone and melts the metal, and turns the air around it into a furnace. The fire is the Balrog's essence. The fire is the physical manifestation of the Balrog's spiritual nature, the nature of a Maya that has been corrupted by Morgoth's influence, whose creative fire has been inverted into destructive fire, whose light has been replaced by heat. But the fire burns without purpose. This is the critical point. The Balrog's fire is not directed. It does not serve a goal. It does not build or create or illuminate. It burns. It consumes. It destroys. The fire is an end in itself, a self-sustaining cycle of destruction that feeds on whatever is near and that produces nothing except ash and darkness and the red glow of embers in the deep. Sauron does not want fire without purpose. Sauron wants fire with purpose, fire that serves his goals, fire that can be directed and controlled and aimed at the targets he chooses. The fire of the furnaces of Barad serves a purpose. It forges weapons. It produces armor. It creates the material of war. The fire of the Balrog serves no purpose. It burns whatever is near and leaves nothing useful behind. The contrast between purposeful fire and purposeless fire is the contrast between Sauron and the Balrog. Sauron is the smith. The Balrog is the wildfire. The smith uses fire as a tool, heating metal, shaping material, creating objects of utility and power. The wildfire uses fire as an expression of its own nature, burning without direction, consuming without discrimination, destroying without purpose. The smith cannot use the wildfire. The smith needs controlled heat, heat that can be directed, focused, applied to the specific task at hand. The wildfire is the opposite of controlled heat. The wildfire is heat without control, and heat without control is the enemy of the smith's art, not its ally. Part 35. The Morgoth connection. There is one more dimension to the Balrog question that is worth exploring. A dimension that involves the deepest theological layers of Tolkien's work, and that connects the Balrog to the ultimate destiny of evil in Middle-earth. The Balrog is connected to Morgoth. Not merely historically, not merely through the shared past of service and corruption, but ontologically. The Balrog carries Morgoth's imprint. The Balrog's corruption is Morgoth's corruption. The the specific, identifiable, Morgoth-shaped corruption that was implanted in the creature during the Elder Days and that has been burning in the Balrog's nature ever since. This connection has implications that go beyond the practical question of whether Sauron can command the Balrog. The connection means that the Balrog is, in a sense, still Morgoth's creature, still shaped by Morgoth's will, still oriented by Morgoth's purpose, still burning with Morgoth's fire. The Balrog's loyalty is to Morgoth, not to darkness in general. And Morgoth is not Sauron. Morgoth's purposes are not Sauron's purposes. Morgoth's darkness is not Sauron's darkness. The Balrog does not recognize Sauron's authority because the Balrog's authority recognition is tuned to a different frequency. The Balrog responds to Morgoth's signal, to the specific, personal, valor-level command that Morgoth broadcast through the corrupted substance of the world. Sauron does not broadcast on this frequency. Sauron broadcasts on his own frequency, the frequency of the ring, the frequency of domination, the frequency of control. And the Balrog's receiver is not tuned to Sauron's signal. The analogy is imprecise but illuminating. The Balrog is a radio that can only receive Morgoth's station. Sauron is broadcasting on a different station. The Balrog cannot hear Sauron's broadcast, not because the Balrog is deaf, but because the Balrog is tuned to a channel that Sauron cannot access. Part 36. The cost of deployment. Even in the most optimistic hypothetical, even in the scenario where Sauron somehow convinces or compels the Balrog to march to war, the deployment carries costs that are almost certainly greater than the benefits. The first cost is attention. A Balrog on the march is the most attention-grabbing military event in the Third Age. Every eye in Middle-earth would turn toward the creature. Every leader, every strategist, every commander on the side of the Free Peoples would redirect their focus toward the Balrog. The creature's deployment would galvanize the resistance, uniting the Free Peoples in a way that Sauron's conventional armies could not. Because the Balrog represents a threat so overwhelming, so existential, so beyond the scope of normal warfare that it would force even the most reluctant allies to cooperate. The second cost is Gandalf. As we discussed, the deployment of the Balrog would almost certainly draw Gandalf to the confrontation, and Gandalf is the most strategically valuable asset on the side of the Free Peoples. Every minute that Gandalf spends fighting a Balrog is a minute that Gandalf is not advising Thodin, not counseling Aragorn, not coordinating the defense of Minas Tirith, not guiding the strategy of the war. But the confrontation with the Balrog would also put Gandalf at risk, and the loss of Gandalf, if the Balrog managed to kill him a second time, would be a devastating blow to the Free Peoples. The strategic calculation is ambiguous. The Balrog might kill some defenders, but it would also pull Gandalf into a fight. The Balrog might break a fortress, but it would also unite the resistance. The Balrog might terrify the enemy, but it would also demonstrate that the ancient terrors can be fought and beaten. The benefits of deployment are matched, point for point, by the costs. And a strategist as careful as Sauron would recognize the uncertainty and choose the reliable option over the risky one. Part 37. The reliable option. Sauron chose the reliable option. He chose the Nazgul over the Balrog. He chose the orcs over the fire spirit. He chose the instruments he could control over the instrument he could not. This choice tells us something important about Sauron's character, something that is easy to miss in the shadow of his villainy. Sauron is disciplined. Sauron is patient. Sauron is, in a dark and terrible way, wise enough to know his limitations, wise enough to work within them, wise enough to resist the temptation of the spectacular in favor of the dependable. The Balrog is spectacular. The Balrog is the most dramatic weapon imaginable. a being of fire and shadow, towering over the battlefield, burning through walls and armies with the elemental fury of a corrupted Maya. The Balrog is the nuclear option, the weapon of last resort, the instrument of total destruction, the thing that you deploy when you want to make a statement rather than when you want to win a war. Sauron does not want to make a statement. Sauron wants to win a war. And winning a war requires instruments that can be aimed, that can be coordinated, that can be integrated into a larger strategy. The Nazgul can be aimed. The Orcs can be coordinated. The Easterlings and the Haradrim can be integrated. The Balrog cannot be aimed, cannot be coordinated, cannot be integrated. The Balrog is a weapon without a trigger, a bomb without a detonator, a fire without a hearth. The choice of the reliable over the spectacular is a defining characteristic of Sauron's approach to power. Sauron does not reach for the dramatic gesture. Sauron does not gamble on uncertain outcomes. Sauron builds, methodically, patiently, with the craftsman's attention to detail and the engineer's respect for the constraints of the material. The Balrog is not part of Sauron's build because the Balrog is not buildable. The Balrog is not a component. It is a force of nature. And forces of nature, however powerful, are not the building blocks of empires. Part 38. The Dark Lord's Toolbox. Let me catalogue Sauron's actual instruments of war, the tools he chose instead of the Balrog, because the catalogue reveals the logic of his strategy and the consistency of his approach. The Nazgul, 9 wraiths, bound to the 9 rings, absolutely loyal, absolutely obedient, absolutely under Sauron's control. The Nazgul are Sauron's perfect instruments, beings whose wills have been completely absorbed by the rings, whose autonomy has been entirely eliminated, whose capacity for independent action has been reduced to 0. The Nazgul do not choose, they do not hesitate, they do not resist. They are extensions of Sauron's will, arms and eyes and voices that operate at Sauron's direction with the precision and the reliability of a machine. The Witch King, the chief of the Nazgul, the Lord of the Nine, the captain of Sauron's forces at the Pelennor Fields. The Witch King is Sauron's field commander, a being of considerable power and tactical capability who can be trusted to execute Sauron's orders without deviation or hesitation. The Orc armies. Hundreds of thousands of orcs, bred and equipped in the pits of Mordor, organized into divisions and companies, commanded by captains who report to the Nazgul who report to Sauron. The Orc armies are the backbone of Sauron's military machine, expendable, replaceable, and absolutely obedient to the chain of command. The Trolls. Larger, stronger, more durable than orcs, the heavy infantry of Sauron's forces, used for siege operations and for breaking defensive formations. Like the orcs, the Trolls are obedient to the dark will that commands them. The Easterlings and the Haradrim. Human allies recruited through diplomacy, bribery, intimidation, and cultural manipulation. The human allies provide the numbers and the variety that Sauron's orc-based military machine lacks: cavalry, siege engineers, archers, the full range of military capabilities that human civilizations have developed over millennia. The Corsairs of Umbar, a naval force, pirates and raiders, the descendants of the Black Menrians, who provide Sauron with the ability to project power along Gondor's coastline and to threaten the White City from the river. Every one of these instruments is controlled. Every one is integrated into Sauron's command structure. Every one operates within a hierarchy that terminates at Sauron's will. Every one can be aimed, directed, coordinated, and combined with the others to produce the kind of multi-front, multi-force, combined arms military campaign that wins wars. The Balrog is none of these things. The Balrog is uncontrolled, unintegrated, uncoordinated, and uncombined. The Balrog is the one asset that Sauron cannot add to his toolbox, the one piece that does not fit the machine, the one instrument that cannot be played in the orchestra. Part 39. The question no one asks. There is a companion question to why didn't Sauron use the Balrog? A question that is equally interesting but that almost no one asks. Why didn't the Balrog use Sauron? The question sounds strange, but it is logically valid. The Balrog is a Maya. The Balrog has power, vast, ancient, devastating power. The Balrog has been sitting under a mountain for 6,000 years, doing nothing, serving no one. If the Balrog had ambitions, if the Balrog wanted to dominate the world, to conquer the free peoples, to impose its will on Middle-earth, the Balrog could have emerged from Moria at any time and started its own campaign of conquest. But the Balrog does not. The Balrog sits. The Balrog sleeps. The Balrog does nothing. Why? Because the Balrog does not want to conquer. The Balrog does not want to rule. The Balrog does not want anything, except perhaps to be left alone in the dark. This is the fundamental difference between the Balrog and Sauron. Sauron wants. Sauron desires. Sauron is driven by the ambition to control, the hunger for dominion, the need to impose his will on every living thing. Sauron's evil is active. It reaches out, it grasps, it seeks to expand its control over everything it touches. The Balrog's evil is passive. It does not reach out. It does not grasp. It does not seek to expand. The Balrog's evil is the evil of the ember, the hot, dangerous, destructive thing that burns whatever touches it, but that does not seek out new fuel. The Balrog does not pursue. The Balrog waits. The Balrog exists in its darkness and destroys whatever enters the darkness, but the Balrog does not leave the darkness to seek new victims. The passivity is a consequence of the Balrog's nature. The Balrog is a weapon without a wielder, a sword without a hand, a gun without a finger on the trigger. The Balrog was made to be directed. The Balrog was made to be aimed. The Balrog was made to be commanded, to receive instructions from a greater will, and to carry those instructions out with fire and fury. Without the greater will, the Balrog does not act. Without the directing intelligence, the weapon lies dormant. The sword does not swing itself. Part 40. The theology of service. The Balrog's passivity points to a deeper theological truth in Tolkien's world, a truth about the nature of evil and the nature of service. In Tolkien's cosmology, all beings are created to serve. The Valar serve Ilúvatar. The Maiar serve the Valar. The elves serve the purposes for which they were created. The men serve the purposes for which they were created. Every being has a function, a role, a place in the grand design, and the fulfillment of that function is the source of the being's joy, its meaning, its sense of purpose. Evil disrupts this service. Evil takes the being's function and corrupts it, turns the servant into a predator, the creator into a destroyer, the builder into a wrecker. But evil does not eliminate the fundamental orientation towards service. The corrupted being still needs to serve something. The corrupted being still needs a will to follow, a purpose to fulfill, a master to obey. The Balrog's corruption turned it from a servant of the good into a servant of the dark. But the fundamental orientation, the need to serve, the need to follow, the need to be directed by a greater will remained. The Balrog served Morgoth not because the Balrog chose to serve, but because the Balrog's nature required service. The Balrog needed a master. The Balrog was designed to need a master, and when the master fell, the need remained, unfulfilled, unsatisfied, driving the Balrog into the catatonic dormancy of a being that cannot function without the directing will it was made to follow. Sauron does not fulfill this need, because Sauron is not the right master. The Balrog was made to serve a Vala. Sauron is a Maya. The spiritual mismatch is profound, like trying to plug a high-voltage appliance into a low-voltage socket. The power that the Balrog needs, the Vala-level, Morgoth-class, ontological authority that the Balrog was designed to respond to, is not available from Sauron. Sauron does not possess the spiritual infrastructure to command a creature that was built to be commanded by a god. Part 41. The Nameless Things. There is a moment in the Two Towers, a passing reference easily overlooked, that illuminates the Balrog's world and the depths beneath Moria that the creature inhabited. Gandalf, describing his pursuit of the Balrog through the roots of the mountains, mentions something strange, far, far below the deepest delving of the dwarves. The world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. They are older than he. The nameless things. Creatures that dwell in the deepest places of the earth, beneath even the Balrog's chambers, in the absolute darkness of the world's foundations. Creatures that are older than Sauron. Creatures that Sauron does not know. This passing reference is devastating for the argument that Sauron controls everything beneath the mountains. Sauron does not even know about the nameless things. Sauron's knowledge, his intelligence network, his surveillance apparatus, none of these reach the depths where the nameless things crawl. The deep places of the earth are beyond Sauron's reach. They are beyond Sauron's knowledge. They are beyond Sauron's power. The existence of the nameless things also tells us something about the Balrog's psychological reality during its millennia of isolation. The Balrog was not alone in the deep, not in the way that we might imagine aloneness. The Balrog was surrounded by things, by the nameless creatures that gnaw the roots of the mountains, by the geological forces that shape the deep earth, by the ancient pre-creation darkness that fills the spaces below the world. The Balrog existed in an environment, a deep, strange, alien environment that has its own ecology, its own rhythms, its own laws. And this environment is not Sauron's. The deep is not Mordor. The darkness under the mountains is not the darkness of the Black Land. The Balrog's world, the world of tunnels and fire and nameless things, is a world that operates according to rules that Sauron did not write and cannot change. The Balrog is not merely out of Sauron's command. The Balrog is out of Sauron's jurisdiction. The Balrog lives in these depths. The Balrog dwells in the borderland between the world of the dwarves and the world of the nameless things, in the zone where Sauron's power fades and the ancient pre-Morgoth darkness of the earth's foundations takes over. The Balrog is not merely out of Sauron's command. The Balrog is out of Sauron's world, inhabiting a depth of existence that Sauron's power and Sauron's knowledge and Sauron's instruments of control cannot penetrate. The nameless things tell us that there are levels of reality in Middle-earth that are beyond even Sauron's reach. There are depths that the Dark Lord has not plumbed, darknesses that the eye has not penetrated, creatures that the ring cannot touch. The world is bigger than Sauron. The darkness is deeper than Sauron. And the Balrog, dwelling in these unmapped depths, is as beyond Sauron's control as the nameless things that gnaw the roots of the world. Part 42. Gandalf's understanding. Gandalf understands the Balrog in a way that Sauron does not, and the understanding tells us something important about the difference between good and evil's approach to power. Gandalf recognizes the Balrog. When the creature appears on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, Gandalf identifies it immediately, names it, categorizes it, understands its nature and its capabilities and its weaknesses. Gandalf knows what the Balrog is because Gandalf is a Maya, and Gandalf's Maya nature allows him to perceive the Balrog's Maya nature with a clarity that mortal eyes cannot achieve. But Gandalf does not try to command the Balrog. Gandalf does not attempt to dominate the creature, to bend it to his will, to redirect its fury towards Sauron's forces. Gandalf fights the Balrog, not as a dominator, but as an equal, not as a master, but as an opponent, not as a being who claims authority over the creature, but as a being who stands against the creature and says, "You shall not pass." The difference between Gandalf's approach and the hypothetical Sauron approach is the difference between respect and domination. Gandalf respects the Balrog's nature, respects the creature's autonomy, its power, its fundamental right to exist as an independent being. Gandalf does not try to use the Balrog. Gandalf tries to stop the Balrog. The distinction is moral, and it is profound. Sauron, if he had attempted to recruit the Balrog, would have approached the creature as a dominator, seeking to impose his will on the Balrog's will, to bend the creature to his purpose, to reduce the independent Maya to a tool of Sauron's ambition. The approach would have failed because the Balrog is not a creature that can be dominated, but it would also have been wrong in Tolkien's moral framework, because the domination of another being's will is the fundamental sin of Sauron's evil. Gandalf does not commit this sin. Gandalf does not dominate. Gandalf opposes, and in opposing, Gandalf preserves both his own moral integrity and the Balrog's fundamental nature as an independent being. The Balrog is destroyed, yes, but it is destroyed in combat, in a fair contest of wills and powers, not reduced and subjugated and used and discarded the way Sauron treats his servants. Part 43. The ring's true reach. Let me return to the ring one more time, because the ring's limitations are central to understanding why Sauron could not use the Balrog. The ring's power is the power to dominate wills, but the ring's power has a shape, a contour, a reach, a specific set of conditions under which it operates effectively, and a specific set of conditions under which it does not. The ring works best on mortal beings. Men are the most susceptible. Their short lives, their intense desires, their fear of death make them vulnerable to the ring's promises. The Nazgul are the proof, 9 kings of men, captured completely, their wills abolished, their identities erased, their very existence reduced to wraith-like dependency on the ring's power. The ring works less well on dwarves. The 7 rings, distributed among the dwarven lords, did not capture the dwarves the way the 9 captured the men. The dwarves were resistant, their stubbornness, their grounding in stone and craft, their psychological solidity made them harder to dominate. The 7 rings amplified the dwarves' existing tendencies, their love of gold, their pride in craft. But the rings did not enslave them. Sauron did not get dwarf wraiths. He got greedy dwarves. The ring works poorly on elves. The 3 elven rings were never touched by Sauron's hand, but even the general power of the one ring, the ambient domination that the ring radiates, operates weakly against elvish wills. The elves perceive the ring's corruption. They resist it. They recognize the danger and withdraw from it. The ring is not useless against elves, but it is significantly less effective than it is against men. The ring does not work on Maya. This is the implicit conclusion of the pattern. If the ring works best on men, less well on dwarves, and poorly on elves, then the ring works not at all on beings of a higher order than elves. The Maiar are higher. The Maiar are spirits of the same order as the ring's creator. The ring cannot dominate its own creator's peers, because the ring's power derives from its creator's power, and a power cannot exceed its own source. The Balrog is a Maya. The ring cannot dominate the Balrog. The question is answered, not through narrative logic or strategic analysis or hypothetical scenarios, but through the fundamental mechanics of the ring's power. The instrument that Sauron relies on for domination does not function against the creature he would need to dominate. Part 44. What the story tells us. The Balrog question, properly understood, is not a question about strategy. It is a question about the nature of evil, and the answer tells us something profound about the universe that Tolkien created. Evil is divided. This is the central insight. Evil is not a monolith. Evil is not a unified force. Evil is a collection of competing, incompatible, mutually suspicious impulses that cannot cooperate, because cooperation requires the very qualities: trust, generosity, the willingness to subordinate self-interest to shared purpose, that evil, by definition, lacks. Sauron cannot use the Balrog because Sauron and the Balrog are different evils. They serve different purposes. They pursue different goals. They embody different corruptions. They are incompatible, not because they are enemies, but because they are incapable of the kind of cooperation that would make the Balrog's power available to Sauron's strategy. Good, by contrast, can cooperate. The Fellowship of the Ring is the proof. 9 beings, an elf, a dwarf, 2 men, 4 hobbits, and a Maya, from different races, different cultures, different backgrounds, carrying different skills and different perspectives, come together and form a functioning alliance. They trust each other. They help each other. They sacrifice for each other. They achieve through cooperation what none of them could have achieved alone. The cooperation is not easy. The fellowship does not come together smoothly. The elf and the dwarf distrust each other. The men are tempted by the ring. The hobbits are overwhelmed by the scale of the mission. The fellowship nearly breaks, and does break, at Amon Hen, when the pressures become too great and the ring's influence drives Boromir to attack Frodo. But the fellowship reforms. The trust that was broken is rebuilt. The alliances that were strained are renewed. The Free Peoples do what the darkness cannot. They repair. They forgive. They start again. Legolas and Gimli rebuild their relationship. Aragorn forgives Boromir. Frodo and Sam carry each other through Mordor. The capacity for repair, for healing the breaks, for restoring the bonds, for choosing trust after betrayal, is the quality that separates the Free Peoples from the darkness. Sauron cannot repair. Sauron's alliances, once broken, stay broken. Sauron's servants, once lost, cannot be recovered. The relationship between Sauron and the Balrog, if there was ever a relationship, broke when Morgoth fell, and it has never been repaired, and it will never be repaired, because the darkness does not have the capacity for the kind of healing that repair requires. The contrast is the moral of the story. Good cooperates. Evil cannot. The Free Peoples form alliances. The dark powers sit in isolation. The Fellowship crosses Middle-earth as a team. The Balrog sits under a mountain, alone. The outcome of the war is not determined by the total power on each side. It is determined by the ability to deploy that power cooperatively. And the ability to cooperate is the exclusive possession of the good. Part 45. The irony of Sauron's position. There is a final irony in the Balrog question, an irony that is devastating to Sauron's self-image and to the entire project of his dominion. Sauron's stated purpose, the purpose he articulates in his speech to Gandalf through the mouth of Saruman, is the establishment of order. Knowledge, rule, order, these are Sauron's values. These are the principles around which Sauron organizes his empire and justifies his conquest. Sauron presents himself as the bringer of order, the being who will impose structure on the chaos of the free world. who will replace the messy, inefficient, ungoverned freedom of Middle-earth with the clean, efficient, perfectly controlled order of Sauron's dominion. And yet, Sauron cannot order the Balrog. The being who claims to be the supreme organizer, the master administrator, the architect of the new world order, this being cannot control a single creature sleeping under a mountain. The champion of order cannot impose order on one of the most powerful relics of the old disorder. The bringer of rule cannot rule one fallen Maya in a cave. The irony is not comedic, it is structural. It reveals the fundamental lie at the heart of Sauron's project. Sauron does not bring order. Sauron brings domination, and domination is not the same thing as order. Domination creates the appearance of order by suppressing resistance. But the suppression does not eliminate the resistance. The resistance continues, underground, in the dark, in the places where the eye cannot see and the ring cannot reach. The Balrog is the resistance. Not the resistance of the free peoples. The Balrog cares nothing for freedom. But the resistance of the undominated. The refusal of a powerful being to submit to a power it does not recognize. Sauron's order is an illusion. The Balrog is the proof. The being who claims to rule everything cannot rule the creature under the mountain. And if the creature under the mountain is beyond Sauron's reach, then Sauron's reach is not as long as he claims, and Sauron's power is not as absolute as he pretends, and the order that Sauron promises is not order at all but the temporary, unstable, ultimately unsustainable domination of a being who cannot even control his own side. Part 46. The deeper answer. Let me draw the threads together now, pull the full answer out of the dozens of strands that we have been weaving through this exploration. Why didn't Sauron use the Balrog during the War of the Ring? Because the Balrog was not Sauron's to use. The Balrog was a Maya, a being of the same order as Sauron, with a will as strong as Sauron's, with a nature as autonomous, with a history of service to a master who was greater than Sauron would ever be. The Balrog served Morgoth. Morgoth was gone. And the loyalty that the Balrog gave to Morgoth did not transfer to Sauron, because loyalty of that kind is personal, not institutional, because Sauron had no mechanism of control. The ring, Sauron's primary instrument of domination, could not operate against a fellow Maya. The Nazgul, Sauron's chain of command, had no authority over a creature of comparable spiritual standing. The Orcs, Sauron's foot soldiers, could not compel a being that the Orcs themselves feared. Sauron had no tool, no technique, no instrument that could bring the Balrog under his authority. Because the Balrog had been alone for 6,000 years. The creature's capacity for service had atrophied. The muscles of obedience had withered. The psychological infrastructure that once allowed the Balrog to function within a hierarchy had dissolved during the millennia of solitary dormancy. The Balrog was feral, a creature that had lost the social instincts, the collaborative habits, the capacity for directed action that military deployment requires. Because the two evils are incompatible. Sauron's evil is the evil of control. The Balrog's evil is the evil of destruction. The controller cannot use the destroyer, because the destroyer destroys the systems that the controller depends on. The authoritarian cannot deploy the anarchist, because the anarchist annihilates the structures of authority that the authoritarian builds. Because Sauron did not need the Balrog. Sauron's military position was strong enough to win without the Balrog. The Nazgul, the Orcs, the allies, the conventional forces, these were sufficient for the campaign. The addition of an uncontrollable Balrog would have added risk without adding proportionate benefit. The reliable instruments were reliable. The spectacular instrument was unreliable. Sauron chose reliability. And because the Balrog was dead, Gandalf killed it. The one Balrog that Sauron might theoretically have attempted to recruit was destroyed on the peak of Ziraxigil, killed by the wizard, killed by the Maya of the good, killed by the being who was sent to Middle-earth specifically to oppose the darkness. The Balrog died, and the question became moot. Part 47, the final parallel. Let me close the theological argument with a parallel that brings the Balrog question full circle. Gandalf and the Balrog are mirror images. Both are Maiar. Both were sent to Middle-earth with a purpose. Both carry the fire of their original nature. Gandalf, the fire of inspiration and courage. The Balrog, the fire of destruction and corruption. Gandalf serves the Valar. The Balrog served Morgoth. Gandalf's service is willing, humble, oriented toward the empowerment of others. The Balrog's service was willing too, but oriented toward the destruction of others, toward the execution of Morgoth's nihilistic purpose, toward the burning of everything that Gandalf protects. The two Maiar meet on the bridge of Khazad Diem. The fire of inspiration confronts the fire of destruction. The servant of the good faces the servant of the fallen, and the confrontation is not merely physical, it is theological. It is the meeting of two competing visions of the universe, two incompatible understandings of what fire is for, two irreconcilable answers to the question that burns at the heart of Tolkien's world. What is power for? Gandalf says, power is for service. Power is for the protection of the weak, the guidance of the lost, the kindling of hope in the darkened world. Power is not for the powerful. Power is for the powerless, channeled through the powerful, exercised by the powerful, but always aimed at the benefit of the powerless. The Balrog says, power is for destruction. Power is for the burning of the world, the consumption of the beautiful, the reduction of the ordered to the chaotic. Power is for itself, self-referential, self-consuming, burning without purpose and without end. Gandalf wins. The fire of service overcomes the fire of destruction. The Maya who serves the good defeats the Maya who serves the dark. And the victory is not merely military. It is cosmological. It is the assertion of a principle, the principle that service is stronger than destruction, that purpose is stronger than chaos, that the fire that warms is stronger than the fire that burns. Part 48. The economy of evil. There is a concept I want to introduce here, a concept that I think captures the Balrog question more precisely than any other framework we have discussed. I call it the economy of evil. In Tolkien's world, evil operates as an economy, a system of exchanges, of costs and benefits, of investments and returns. Every act of evil has a cost. Every exercise of dark power diminishes the being who exercises it. Every expansion of domination depletes the resources that make domination possible. Morgoth is the supreme example. Morgoth, the mightiest of the Valar, diminished himself by pouring his power into the world. The dissemination that gave Morgoth control over his creatures also drained Morgoth's personal power. By the end of the First Age, Morgoth was a shadow of the being he had been in the beginning, smaller, weaker, more dependent on his servants and his fortifications. A Valar who had spent so much of his substance on the corruption of the world that he could no longer face the host of Valinor in battle. Sauron followed a similar path, but with a different currency. Sauron poured his power into the ring, concentrating his essence into a single object, gaining the ability to dominate other wills, but losing the ability to exist independently of the object. The ring gave Sauron power. The ring also made Sauron vulnerable, dependent on a single artifact, killable by the destruction of a single piece of gold. The economy of evil explains the Balrog question. Bringing the Balrog under Sauron's control, if it were even possible, would require an expenditure of power. Sauron would have to invest spiritual energy, strategic resources, and political capital in the attempt to dominate a fellow Maya. The investment would be enormous, and the return, an uncontrollable, unpredictable, potentially self-defeating weapon, would be uncertain at best. Sauron is a careful investor. He does not spend power on uncertain returns. He spends power on guaranteed returns, on the Nazgul, whose obedience is total, on the Orcs, whose compliance is assured, on the Allies, whose cooperation is purchased with promises and threats. The Balrog is a bad investment. The cost of domination is high. The return on domination is uncertain. The risk of failure is significant. The careful investor passes. Part 49. The Silent War. There is a war within the darkness, a silent, invisible, unacknowledged war between the different forms of evil that inhabit Middle-earth. And the Balrog question is a battle in this war. Sauron's evil competes with Morgoth's evil. Not directly, Morgoth is gone, and his evil persists only in the creatures and the corruptions that he left behind. But the competition is real. Sauron's authoritarian darkness struggles to absorb and to integrate the nihilistic darkness that Morgoth implanted in the world. The struggle is constant, invisible, and ultimately irresolvable, because the two darknesses are fundamentally incompatible, and neither can absorb the other without destroying itself. The Balrog is the most visible manifestation of this competition. The Balrog is Morgoth's evil, incarnated, burning in the deep places of the earth. Sauron's evil surrounds the Balrog, the Orcs in Moria, the Nazgul in the sky, the ring's influence radiating from Mordor. But Sauron's evil cannot touch the Balrog. The two darknesses coexist in proximity, occupying the same geography, breathing the same corrupted air, but unable to merge, unable to cooperate, unable to become the unified force that would make the darkness invincible. The silent war is the darkness's deepest weakness. If the darkness could unite, if Sauron's controlling evil and Morgoth's destructive evil could merge into a single, coordinated, purposeful force, the Free Peoples would be overwhelmed. The combined power of domination and destruction, of the Ring and the Balrog, of the Chain and the Fire, would be unstoppable. No alliance of elves and men and dwarves could resist it. No Gandalf could confront it. No hobbit could carry the ring through it. But the darkness cannot unite. The competition between Sauron's evil and Morgoth's evil prevents the unification. The chain cannot embrace the fire cannot submit to the chain. The controller and the destroyer are locked in a silent, permanent, insoluble antagonism, two forms of evil that cannot cooperate, cannot compromise, cannot build the shared purpose that unity requires. And the antagonism runs through everything. It is not just the Balrog. Consider the Nazgul and the mouth of Sauron, servants who despise each other, who compete for Sauron's favor, who would happily see each other destroyed if it meant an advancement in their own standing. Consider Saruman, who was supposed to be Sauron's ally, and who immediately began plotting his own conquest, using the Palantir to gather intelligence for his own campaign, rather than sharing it with Mordor. Consider the Orcs, the rank-and-file soldiers of the dark, who fight each other as readily as they fight the enemy, who murder their own commanders, who desert and betray and sabotage the war effort because their loyalty extends no further than their own survival. Every level of Sauron's operation is undermined by the same principle: evil does not cooperate. The darkness tears at itself. The servants distrust the master. The master distrusts the servants. The alliances are fragile. The loyalties are contingent. The entire edifice of Sauron's power is riddled with the cracks that come from building an empire on domination rather than trust. The Balrog is simply the largest and most dramatic crack. The Balrog is the most visible proof that the darkness cannot hold itself together, that the most powerful available asset sits unused because the darkness lacks the capacity for the kind of partnership that would make the asset usable. The free peoples win because the darkness is divided. This is the answer, the final, deepest, most fundamental answer to the Balrog question. Why didn't Sauron use the Balrog? Because evil cannot cooperate. Because the darkness is at war with itself. Because the division that corrupted the Maiar in the Great Music still divides the darkness in the Third Age, and the division is the crack in the armor, the weakness in the wall, the flaw in the design that allows two hobbits to carry a ring to a volcano and destroy the Dark Lord's power forever. Part 50. The Sleeping Fire. The Balrog sleeps. For 6,000 years the Balrog sleeps, buried in the roots of the mountains, wrapped in its own fire, dreaming the dreams of a fallen Maiar in the darkness beneath the world. What does the Balrog dream? We cannot know. Tolkien does not tell us. But we can speculate, and the speculation illuminates the creature's nature in ways that the narrative alone cannot. Perhaps the Balrog dreams of Angband, of the great fortress in the north, of the iron gates and the pits of fire, of the throne of Morgoth and the armies that marched from the darkness to challenge the elves and the Valar. Perhaps the Balrog dreams of the wars, of the charges across the smoking plains, of the fortresses broken and the cities burned, of the elven lords who fell beneath the Balrog's whip and sword. Perhaps the Balrog dreams of Morgoth, of the Master, of the Valar who shaped the Balrog's nature, who gave the Balrog its purpose, who directed the fire and the fury toward the targets that Morgoth chose. Perhaps the Balrog dreams of the connection, the deep, ontological, Valar-to-Maiar bond that linked the Balrog to its master and that gave the Balrog's existence its meaning. Perhaps the Balrog dreams of nothing. Perhaps the long millennia of solitary darkness have stripped the Balrog of its capacity for memory, for imagination, for the internal life that sustains a conscious being through the years. Perhaps the Balrog's dormancy is not sleep, but oblivion, a blank, dreamless void, the spiritual equivalent of the physical darkness that surrounds the creature. Whatever the Balrog dreams, it dreams alone. And the aloneness, the absolute, total, 6,000-year aloneness, is the final answer to the question. Sauron cannot use the Balrog because the Balrog is not there. The Balrog is not present in the world that Sauron operates in. The Balrog is in the deep, in the darkness, in the silence, in the place below the world where Sauron's power does not reach and Sauron's voice does not carry. The Balrog is sleeping. And Sauron, for all his power, cannot wake what does not wish to be woken. Part 51. The Pattern of Tolkien's Evil. The Balrog question reveals a pattern in Tolkien's depiction of evil, a pattern that extends beyond the Balrog and beyond Sauron, and that illuminates the entire moral architecture of Middle-earth. Evil diminishes. This is the pattern. Every generation of evil is weaker than the last. Morgoth is the greatest evil, the mightiest of the Valar, the most powerful being to serve the darkness. Sauron is lesser, a Maiar, not a Valar, a servant rather than a master, a being of the second rank rather than the first. The Witch King is lesser still, a man, not a Maiar, a creature enslaved by a ring rather than a being who chose darkness freely. Each generation inherits less power, less authority, less capacity for the kind of evil that shaped the Elder Days. The Balrog is a relic of the greater evil, a creature of Morgoth's era, carrying Morgoth's power, burning with Morgoth's fire. The Balrog's continued existence in the Third Age is an anachronism, a piece of the past that has survived into a present that has moved beyond it. The Balrog does not belong in the Third Age. The Balrog belongs in the First Age, in the age of Morgoth, in the age of nihilistic destruction, in the age when the darkness was at its most powerful and its most terrible. Sauron's inability to use the Balrog is an expression of this diminishment. The Dark Lord of the Third Age cannot command the servants of the Dark Lord of the First Age, because the Third Age Dark Lord is lesser, is weaker, is a shadow of the shadow that came before. Sauron is diminished evil trying to command preserved evil, and the preserved evil, still burning with the greater fire, does not submit to the lesser flame. The pattern of diminishment is Tolkien's answer to the problem of evil. Evil does not endure. Evil does not grow. Evil diminishes, generation by generation, age by age, each iteration weaker than the last, each Dark Lord lesser than his predecessor. The world is getting better, the darkness is getting smaller. The evil that threatens the Third Age is less than the evil that threatened the First. And the evil that will come after Sauron will be less than Sauron. The Balrog is the proof. The creature that Morgoth could command and Sauron cannot is the evidence that the darkness is declining, that each age produces a lesser villain, each war faces a weaker enemy, each generation of free peoples stands against a diminished threat. The Balrog is the measuring stick. Set it against Morgoth, and Morgoth commands it. Set it against Sauron, and Sauron cannot. The decline is visible. The diminishment is real. The world is getting better, slowly, painfully, at terrible cost, but better. Part 52. The question reversed. Let me reverse the question one final time. Instead of asking why didn't Sauron use the Balrog, let me ask, what does it mean that Sauron couldn't use the Balrog? It means that Sauron's power is limited. The being who presents himself as the supreme authority in Middle-earth, the Dark Lord, the ruler of all, the eye that sees everything, cannot command one creature sleeping under one mountain. The pretension of omnipotence is exposed. The claim of absolute authority is falsified. Sauron is not as powerful as he claims. Sauron is not as powerful as he believes. Sauron is a being of considerable but bounded power, operating within constraints that he cannot overcome and limitations that he cannot transcend. It means that evil is fractured. The darkness that threatens the world is not a unified force, but a collection of incompatible impulses, each pursuing its own agenda, each serving its own nature, each burning with its own fire. The fracture is permanent. The darkness cannot be unified because the very qualities that make darkness dark, the selfishness, the distrust, the drive to dominate, prevent the cooperation that unification requires. It means that the world is not as hopeless as it looks. If evil could unite, if every dark power in Middle-earth could be coordinated under a single will, the free peoples would be doomed. But evil cannot unite. And the inability to unite is the crack through which hope enters. The crack is small, the crack is narrow, but the crack is real, and through it, two hobbits can walk to a volcano and destroy a ring and save the world. Part 53. The final image. Let me close with an image that I think captures the entire Balrog question in a single vivid, unforgettable picture. Imagine the map of Middle-earth. Spread it out on a table. Mark the positions. In the southeast, Mordor, Barad-dûrthr, the Eye of Sauron, blazing on the summit of the Dark Tower, surveying the world with the tireless vigilance of a being who will not rest until everything is under his control. The Nazgul circle overhead. The Orc armies mass behind the Black Gate. The siege towers are being built. The war machine is running. In the center, the misty mountains, Moria, the deep places beneath the peaks, where the abandoned halls of the dwarves echo with the footsteps of goblins and the drip of water and the faint, barely perceptible pulse of heat from the chamber far below, the chamber where the Balrog lies. Between them, the gap. 500 miles of open territory, of Rohan's plains, of Gondor's rivers, of the Anduin's broad current, and the Emyn-Muil's grey hills. 500 miles of distance that Sauron's will can cross, but that the Balrog will not cross. 500 miles that separate the controlling evil from the destructive evil, the Dark Lord of the Third Age from the relic of the First, the being who commands everything from the creature that commands nothing. And somewhere in that gap, on a road, in a marsh, climbing a stair cut into the face of a mountain, two hobbits are walking. Two small, insignificant, overlooked hobbits, carrying a gold ring on a chain, walking through the space between the two evils, walking through the crack that the darkness cannot close. The hobbits can walk through the gap because the gap exists. The gap exists because the darkness is divided. The darkness is divided because evil cannot cooperate. And the Balrog, the sleeping fire under the mountain, the relic of Morgoth's darkness, the creature that Sauron cannot command and cannot use, is the reason the gap is there. The gap is the answer. The gap is the distance between Sauron and the Balrog, not merely geographical but spiritual, theological, ontological. The gap is the space that evil cannot bridge, because evil cannot cooperate. The gap is the crack in the darkness. The gap is the flaw in the design. The gap is the reason that the free peoples have a chance. The reason that two hobbits can carry a ring through the shadow and destroy it. The reason that the darkness, for all its terrible power, is not invincible. The Balrog sleeps. Sauron watches. And between them, in the gap that evil cannot close, the world goes on, breathing, living, fighting, hoping, carrying the small ring toward the fire that will unmake it, and in the unmaking, prove that the darkness was never as strong as it claimed to be. Part 54. The answer. Why didn't Sauron use the Balrog during the War of the Ring? Because the Balrog was not his. Because the Balrog was not anyone's. Because the Balrog was a fallen Maya, a peer, not a servant, a relic, not a resource, a creature of independent will and ancient power that no Dark Lord of the diminished Third Age could command. Because the darkness is divided. Because evil cannot cooperate. Because the very qualities that make the Balrog powerful, the fire, the independence, the Morgoth-forged nature, are the qualities that make the Balrog unusable by any power that is not Morgoth. Because Sauron knew his limits. Because Sauron was a careful strategist who worked with the tools he could control rather than reaching for the tools he could not. Because the Dark Lord who forged the One Ring understood, better than anyone, the difference between the power you possess and the power you merely covet, and because the Balrog was dead. Gandalf killed it. The Maya who was sent to oppose the darkness destroyed the creature that the darkness could not control, and in destroying it, Gandalf removed the question from the realm of the hypothetical and placed it in the realm of the settled. The Balrog is gone. The sleeping fire is extinguished. The creature that might have changed the war was killed before the war began. The answer is not a plot hole. The answer is the plot. The inability of evil to coordinate, the fundamental, structural, ontological inability of the darkness to cooperate with itself, is the reason the free peoples have a chance. The gap between Sauron and the Balrog is the same gap that Frodo walks through on the way to Mount Doom. The crack in the darkness is the path through the shadow. The Balrog was the most powerful unused weapon in the War of the Ring. And the reason it was unused is the reason the war was won. Thank you for spending this evening with me. The Balrog question seems simple, a question about strategy, a question about military assets, a question about why a villain did not deploy a weapon. But the question, properly understood, reaches into the deepest foundations of Tolkien's world. It touches the nature of evil. It reveals the theology of power. And it tells us, in the end, that the darkness is not as strong as it appears. Because the darkness, for all its fire and all its shadow, cannot do the one thing that would make it invincible: work together. Until next time.